Hello, you are listening to Through Time and Clades, and my name is Albert,
And I'm Joan.
and we are back again this week, this time with a new episode of our series, Dinosaurs, the second chapter, which is about the evolution of modern type birds. Um, I guess to start off, as always, how are you doing this week?
I've been doing very well. I finished most of move in last week, and we're just now just kind of settling things here in our new apartment.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, I've been reading, and I mentioned this a little bit in our last episode, our Homo sapiens coverage. I was reading a new book on human evolution called A Story of Us
Mm.
by Leslie Newson and Peter J. Richardson. I have my copy right here. I'm almost done reading it, and I am very, very impressed. Um, the subtitle is A New Look at Human Evolution, and my goodness, it's such a nice change of scenery from previous human evolution books that I've read, which those were still pretty good. But this particular book is committed to kind of recentering women and children in the story of human origins because they often kind of get pushed to the side or almost neglected.
Mm.
I mean, when's the last time you heard about, Neanderthal children or early Australopithecine kids that aren't,
Mm.
the tongue child,
All
right?
right.
So like how our lineage has changed over time and what it means to live in families and communities and how like our concepts of those have changed over
Mm.
time, and it's really great. Um, it covers the period of time from our most recent common ancestor with chimpanzees, and it goes all the way into modern times
Mm.
and a little bit into the future.
Wow.
And what's really neat about this book is that each chapter is framed by narratives.
Mm.
So let me see if I can have there's about 8 chapters, and of the seven, each one starts out with like, oh, here's how we think your ancestors lived 7 million years ago, 3 million years ago, 100,000 years ago,
Mm.
and it's all based on evidence. Like in the subsequent pages following the narratives, like it's made clear how we know what we know we don't know, and what is speculation.
Mm.
But the narratives read like novels, and they get more enticing and more gripping
Yeah.
as the book goes on. Because I mean, like our societies have grown so complex in the 7 million years that our lineage has been around or so.
Mm.
So it's like you start out with like oh, it's like you're reading a wildlife behavioral paper
All
about
right.
some great ape species somewhere, and then you start getting to like narratives of like ice age children
Mm.
or like kids who are living at the start of the Holocene epoch,
Mm.
and you like feel for these characters who you're only hanging out with for like a few pages at a time,
Yeah.
like that good. um, and then of course the subsequent like data and information that informs those narratives and like what we know about families and communities and individuals in the past
Mm.
really ties it all together. So yeah, I've been reading that. I'm almost done with it, and already I like can't recommend it enough. There's like about 5 books or so on human origins that I've really grown attached to, and
Mm.
I'll have to add this one to that as part of the recommendations for anybody wanting to dive deeper into that sort of subject material. So that's been what I've been up to. What about you, buddy?
Oh, yeah, I've been, as usual, keeping busy, trying to pull together a lot of different things, trying to start wrapping up my current research project, and successful to varying degrees. Yeah,
Wow.
just managed to get some things I wanted to get done. Other things I have to leave for later. But in any case, that's all eventually going to come together, and that's been taking up quite a bit of my time. But yeah, that's how my week has been going. But it's been all right. I've been keeping well and everything. So uh, yeah, things are okay over here.
Well, that's good. It's good to hear.
Yeah. So I guess before we jump into the main episode, I think I should probably apologize for making the last episode of Dinosaurs: the Second Chapter so long. Um, so Yeah, so it was because I knew it would be a long episode because there was a lot to say about fossil penguins, but I did not intend it to be over 3 hours long. It was kind of a funny thing that happened while we were recording that episode was I literally did actually lose track of time. Like when we were at the 3 hour mark, I thought we were still at the 2 hour mark. I'm like, oh okay, I still got a bit of time. Anyways, so that's kind of what happened with that one. Hopefully it won't happen again. And I do know like obviously there's a certain um, there's a certain length to which people tend to gravitate towards when it comes to podcasts, and I of course different people have different preferences, but I know speaking from personal experience, I think 3 hours in one go would be pushing it a little bit. Not that you're discouraged from taking breaks or anything, but still I do like to try and keep these episodes somewhat reasonably long. So I will try to avoid making any more 3 hour episodes, hopefully. um, but yeah, in this episode, we're gonna kind of do a continuation of that last episode because as long as that last episode was, we haven't finished talking about this waterbird clade yet, and today we will be talking about the remaining members of this group that we didn't cover last time. And this group, well, all the members that we were going to talk about in this episode all belong to one clade called Pelecanimorphae within the waterbird clade. Um, so let's get started on the next slide.
All
So
right.
yeah, this is just a review of what we already covered and where we're going next. So we talked last time about how there's this big clade of birds that all largely seem to be adapted to aquatic environments. So we saw the Phaetontomorphs, which include the tropic birds, and also a weird New Caledonian species called the kagu, and another also weird neotropical species called the sunbittern. Some of the few members of this clade that aren't as aquatically tied, although the sunbittern does hunt in freshwater environments. Um, we saw the loons, which are super specialized for foot propelled diving to the point where they basically can't walk on land and are highly dependent on water for anything they do, even flying because they need a large enough expanse of water to run on and take off, and also land too. And of course, we saw the penguins, which are also very specialized divers, this time wing propelled instead of foot propelled divers, and have a really good fossil record thanks to very dense bones. And of course, famously, they can't fly anymore, at least not through the air. Um, and despite that, they are closely related to the Procelariforms, or tube-nosed birds, which are superb flyers, and they spend most of their lives flying out over the ocean or swimming on top of the ocean surface. And they are also a very interesting group with many unusual adaptations. But there is still one group left in this big waterbird clade that we haven't really covered, and these are the Pelecanimorphs. And before I dive into them, I'd just like to say that I think about a week after we released the last Dinosaurs the Second Chapter episode, a new paper came out that actually pertains to this particular slide right here, and that is a new paper came out naming a new clade, or rather giving a new name to a clade in this group, and I have labeled this here, and that is the clade Fair Acornithes. So this is a newly named clade that includes all the members of Acornithes. So Acornithes includes the loons, penguins, tube noses, and the Pelecanimorphs. And Fair Acornithes includes all of those except for the loons. So that's a newly named, kind of hot off the press name that just got coined. So yeah, bit of trivia there, but it's interestingly timely, I guess. um, so as it happens, most of the members that we talked about in the last episode are, they are super specialized kind of uh, aquatic or marine predators. Like the Phaetontomorphs and the Procelariforms, they just spend most of their lives flying over the ocean and may not see land for many months. And penguins spend a lot of their time out in the open ocean, or at least in the ocean, and mostly come to land to breed and to molt. And loons pretty much spend most of their times out on the water too. They hardly ever come onto land if they can help it. Um, But the members of the Pelecanimorphs that we're going to talk about today, even though most of them are, predators in aquatic environments, they are not quite so specialized in terms of like actually living in aquatic environments for most part. Um, so they've kind of taken some very different pathways in terms of becoming aquatic hunters. It's interesting to see all this variation in this one big group of water birds, and they all form a clade. All right, so let's go on to the next slide because before we go into all the individual groups of pelecanimorphs, we should clarify a few things about their classification because the members of this group have traditionally been classified into two different groups, basically the Cenozoic and the Pelecaniforms. And so traditionally, the traditional version, the traditional concept of Cenozoic or all the so-called stork-like birds. So these are, these long-legged, long-beaked wading birds. So the herons and ibises, and of course the storks, were all classified as members of this group. And sometimes people even included things like flamingos, which we now know are not closely related to these guys at all. And meanwhile, we had as a separate group the Pelecaniforms, which of course includes pelicans, but also things like boobies and cormorants and frigatebirds, and also the tropic birds, which we talked about last time. So all of these are relatively short-legged birds, often with big webbed feet. Also aquatic hunters, but seemingly with a very different kind of body plan from the wading versions. And so these are considered two separate groups. You can find this traditional classification in, not only really old books, but even in relatively recent literature, like even into the 2000s, you can flip open bird books or read bird papers and see people using these terms to refer to these separate groups. But then we got better at, molecular phylogenetics, and it turns out that this kind of classification does not actually reflect the true relationships of these birds at all. So I think on the next slide, I show our current understanding of the phylogeny of these birds. And so it turns out that, for example, the herons and ibises were not as closely related to storks as they were to pelicans. So it turns out that the herons and ibises don't actually group with the storks to the exclusion of the pelicans. And since Cenozoic is named after Ciconia, a stork genus, now the term Cenozoic is only used for the storks proper, because as you can see on here, there's nothing that really groups with the storks to the exclusion of those other traditional Cenozoic and Pelecaniforms. And in fact, it turns out that the herons and ibises are even more closely related to the pelicans than things like the boobies and cormorants were. And so, what do we do here? Well, you could make the argument that you could say that they are all pelecaniforms. So the boobies and the cormorants and the pelicans and the herons and the ibises, we could call them all pelecaniforms, which would be perfectly defensible. However, kind of the system that most of the major ornithological authorities use today is to actually split out the boobies and cormorants away from the pelicans, so give them their own group, the Suliforms, named after the booby genus Sula. And then in the Pelecaniformes, instead, of course, we have to keep the pelicans there because it's named after them. But now the herons and the ibises and a few other groups too are now considered Pelecaniforms, even though they weren't traditionally. So it's a little confusing because we are applying these old names to very kind of new and different concepts, but this is kind of the current version of Pelecanimorph classification, and so now we understand that it's not that all the long-legged wading ones form a group and the short-legged ones form a group. It's kind of a mixture of different ecologies and different groups going on here. Do you have anything to add before we continue?
I guess it's more a question of convergent evolution
Mm-hmm.
that storks and herons might have looked the same, or is it
Yeah.
like would they have looked more stork-like at the start of the common ancestry and
Right.
diverged from there, or I'm curious like how the morphology would have changed then between
Yeah,
all the
yeah, that is a great question, and unfortunately, we don't have a lot of good fossils to help us answer that. So, like the very earliest stork fossils are recognizably storks, and the very earliest like heron fossils are recognizably herons. It's hard to say exactly what the ancestral condition would have been like. Um, but I will show a fossil stem ibis later on in the episode, and that species has shorter legs than modern ibis does. So, I, if I had to guess, I would guess like something maybe moderately short-legged, maybe not to the extent of like a typical Suliform short-leggedness, because they have very short legs to a rather extreme degree, but something maybe proportionately like a rail maybe. Like obviously rails are not members of this group, but I'm thinking something similar in terms of anatomical proportions to a rail, where the hind legs are kind of leggy, but not super leggy like a stork or a heron. Um, so that would be my guess, but we don't really have enough good fossils to tell for sure.
Gotcha, sure. Okay.
Yeah. So definitely a lot to learn there, but we will see that almost each of these groups does have some interesting fossil record for us to look at. So there will be fossils in this episode. Um, on the next slide, I talk a little bit more about some of the major features of Pelecanimorphs. There are over 180 living species, so it's fairly diverse. Um, I would say probably one of the I don't know if it's most obvious, but a particularly interesting feature of Pelecanimorphs is that their hallux, which is a feature we've talked before in this series, their hallux is longer than in other members of Acornithes. So the hallux is the innermost toe, equivalent to our big toe. And in modern birds, it points backwards, so typically it's used to grasp onto things, usually for perching and things like that. Now, in all the other members of Acornithes, all the other things we've talked about, like loons and penguins and petrels, the hallux is very small. So those guys don't perch in trees much. I know like there are some petrels that will like climb into trees and you use that as a takeoff point, but they're not like using their feet to like kind of grasp and perch onto the branch, or more like kind of just standing on the branch. Whereas in Pelecanimorphs, the hallux is actually long enough to be a gripping kind of device. And so they often perch in trees, and many of them, not all of them, but many of them, nest in trees, usually building these big nests out of sticks. I've seen nesting colonies of great blue herons, and you can see very obviously the huge stick nests, very prominent. And it's quite a sight to see a lot of them all together. And yeah, I guess perching in trees is not something you usually typically think of in waterbirds. It's often quite a sight to see, a heron or a cormorant or a pelican standing in a tree and go, oh yeah, they can do that. Um, but yeah, it is something they do, and of course it can be useful to build nests in trees to avoid land predators. And pictured here is a great blue heron with its nest full of nearly fully grown young, probably pestering it for food. And so it's yeah, bit of a headache there. Uh, but it is a rather pelecanomorph thing to do, to build these big stick nests in trees. And in fact, we will meet one particular species later that builds one of the biggest bird nests of all, interestingly enough. So yeah, that's something that sets them apart from other members of this waterbird clade. Well, at least from the other Acornithes. In terms of anatomical features, there are a few features that they seem to share. One of these is that a bone in their upper jaw called the maxilla. So the frontmost bone in the snout in your typical tetrapod, your typical land vertebrate, is called the premaxilla, the very front of the mouth, basically. And in modern birds, the premaxilla is very large. So most of the beak is basically the premaxilla, most of the upper beak you see there. Whereas the bone right behind it, the maxilla, in modern birds tends to be very small. Like oftentimes, you just quickly looking at a skull, you're gonna miss it because it's not easy to see. But something unusual about the maxilla in Pelecanimorphs is that on the inside kind of surface of it, it has this kind of spongy texture, and it actually the spongy texture actually invades into their nasal cavity for some reason. And in fact, we will meet a number of Pelecanimorphs later that where the nasal cavity is basically filled in by this spongy bone, which is very odd. Um, why they have this, I don't think anyone really knows. It's just a weird thing they have. As usual with a lot of bird features, people haven't really gone too much trouble trying to figure out the functional kind of significance. So plenty of work for grad students to do. There are a number of other features in Pelecanimorphs that are widespread, but because of this whole reshuffling in their classification, it's not always clear whether or not these features are ancestral to the group or have originated several times in the group. But nonetheless, here are a few of these common features to the group. One of them is that the palatines, which are two bones in the palate, we talked about those way back when we were talking about the distinction between paleonate birds and neonate birds. Um, so kind of the major division that splits all modern birds into those two lineages. The palatines are some of the major bones of the palate, and in the Pelecanimorphs, or many of them, they are often fused together. So there are two, there's one palatine on each side. It's a paired bone, but in Pelecanimorphs it fuses along the midline and forms this big plate. Something else interesting is that on their third toe, so when we are talking anatomically, we number fingers and toes from the innermost outward. So, as mentioned before, the hallux, the hallux is basically the first toe. That's what we would call it in kind of anatomical terminology when we're numbering the toes. So the hallux is the first toe, and then the next one out is the second toe, and the next one out from that is the third toe, and the outermost toe in birds is the fourth toe, because birds do not have a fifth toe like other theropod dinosaurs, whereas we do. And so the third toe is kind of often the longest toe in the foot. And in a lot of Pelecanimorphs, the claw on the third toe is interestingly shaped. So it has this kind of comb-like serrated structure along the kind of the bottom edge of it. And what this is useful for is for preening, basically. Birds spend a lot of time keeping their feathers clean and tidy, and of course, they primarily use their bills for doing this. But as you might imagine, there's a problem, and that is that with the bill you can't reach your own head with it, right? So oftentimes birds, when they're cleaning their head feathers, will have to use their feet, and it seems like Pelecanimorphs have evolved a specific adaptation to aid with this very important kind of thing that they have to do, and that is this comb-shaped claw on their foot, which they use to help scratch, their feathers clean and things like that. There are a few other groups of birds that have this feature. Namely, some of the owls do, and also the nightjars do. But neither of these groups are very closely related to the Pelecanimorphs, so clearly there's some convergence going on. As for why this is not seen in any other groups of birds, I don't know. I'm not sure anyone has looked at that or tried to figure out a reason for that. But that is a quite a distinctive feature that they have. And finally, the last feature I've listed on here is that a lot of Pelecanimorphs have what we call a bony bridge underneath their 8th to 11th neck vertebrae. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, birds have many more neck vertebrae than we do. So as mammals, most mammals are limited to 7 neck vertebrae. As mammals, so are we. We have 7 neck vertebrae. But even a bird with with relatively few neck vertebrae has something like 10 neck vertebrae at least. So they have many more neck vertebrae than we do, and it's customary for them to have much more than 10. And so the 8th to 11th neck vertebrae in a Pelecanimorph are vertebrae towards the back half of the neck. And so underneath the neck vertebrae, there are these projections. And in the Pelecanimorphs, on each of the vertebrae from the 8th to the 11th, there is often a bridge connecting those projections. So each vertebrae has its own bridge. This is not all the vertebrae being connected by one bridge kind of situation. Each of the neck vertebrae has its own. And what is this for? Well, one possibility is that it kind of reinforces the neck for when these birds kind of strike at their prey. And if you're familiar with herons, you probably know how they feed. So they can dart their heads forward very quickly with their neck, and a lot of these birds kind of use a kind of similar feeding motion. So probably this kind of bony bridge helps them with that feeding strike. So yep, that seems like a plausible explanation. Um, all right. Do you have anything else to add about general pelecanomorph features?
Not particularly, no.
Cool. So let's go to the next slide, and we can start looking at each of the major groups in turn. So let's start with the storks. So, like I mentioned earlier, we don't have like really early stork fossils that show us what the very ancestral storks were like, but we do have a number from the Oligocene onward that are identifiable as storks, and many of them can even be linked to specific modern storks that they are likely to be most closely related to. I'll give some examples on the next slide. There are 19 living species, and that seems to be pretty consistent between all the different taxonomic authorities. Seems to be the case for now. They are found on all the continents except for Antarctica, although they prefer relatively warm regions, so you don't find them very, very far north or anything like that. Like in the United States, for example, they are primarily restricted to places like Florida, where we have things like the wood stork. Um, but yeah, they don't venture up into the colder regions that often. Um, Let me think. I'm trying to remember if I've actually seen a stork in the wild before, and I don't think I have. I think most places I've lived in long term were just a bit too far north to for storks to be comfortable. And now they are starting to return to the UK. Interesting enough, I think they were recorded. White storks were recorded breeding here recently, but yeah, obviously they're still a relatively rare species here, so I haven't seen them around. Um, you spent quite a bit of time in Florida. Have you seen a wood stork down there?
I can't remember if I have.
Hmm.
I honestly don't think I've seen wood storks when I've gone down there.
I see.
Um, we haven't, because we don't usually travel
Yeah.
near a lot of the swampy areas, or haven't
Right.
really
Right.
traveled near a lot of those places. Like I've never been to the Everglades.
I see. Yeah.
That's a bucket list thing for sure.
Yeah. For sure.
Um,
Me too.
I imagine I'd see them there. It's like the
Right.
perfect place to find them.
Right.
The only, because like storks are weird, because of course, I think we mentioned this like when we talked about cranes,
Hmm.
is that people will see a long-legged, long-necked bird, and they'll call it a crane or a stork
Right.
without really knowing what it actually is.
Right.
So of course people will say like, "Oh look, I saw a stork the other day," and
Hmm.
it's like, "Oh, it was a heron," or it was
Right.
one of the sandhill cranes we'd see in
Hmm.
Florida.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but yeah, it's one of those birds I grew up with but never really saw.
Hmm.
Like the only thing that comes to mind is that some zoos would have white storks
Right.
with their like African wildlife or just
Uh-huh.
in a general like aviary area, and that's the most of it for me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I've definitely seen a few species in captivity, but yeah, I don't think I've seen them in the wild yet. So, yeah, that definitely is something I hope to fix in in the future at some point. Um, But yeah, interesting bunch of birds, and of course, yeah, again, these long-necked, long-legged birds do often get confused with one another. When we get to herons, I will mention a fairly straightforward way to tell herons apart from the rest. Um, but in any case, one of the very distinctive features about storks is that their beak is absolutely massive, and you can see that in the pictures here. Like it's several times the length of the rest of their face, basically, especially in things like the marabou stork. Um, and storks have a variety of kind of feeding habits, but overall they tend to be most of them are not that picky. They like to feed near water. But they'll pretty much eat anything they can find, anything that they are able to swallow. You know, frogs, fish, small mammals, small reptiles, snails, crustaceans. They'll eat all, but although some of them do have their preferences. For example, there are two species, one in Asia, one in Africa, and they're both called open-bill storks, which are specialized for feeding on snails. And the marabou stork that is pictured on here, which a lot of people consider to be one of the ugliest birds in the world, um, is often a scavenger. So they do also hunt for prey. In the recent documentary series, A Perfect Planet, they showed marabou storks hunting young flamingos, for example, which is quite a sight. Um,
Oh,
yeah, yeah, they can go after fairly sizable animals because marabou storks are big birds. I mean, storks in general are not small birds, but marabou storks they can get to what, like 5 feet tall, something like that. Um, so yeah, they're big. Um, and what they'll do often though is that they'll scavenge from carcasses. So they'll hang out with vultures and gather around at carcasses to feed. Now the beak of a stork is not that good for actually ripping a carcass apart. It's like long and straight, so there's no hook at the end. So if it wants to get the carcass of a much bigger animal apart, what they usually do is they'll wait for things like vultures to do that first. Vultures, of course, do have hooked bills, and then because the marabou storks are so massive, they can sometimes kind of push aside the other scavengers to get to the parts that they like to eat. Um, and so yeah, that's something they do. They'll also hang around places where people are throwing out food and eat leftovers there. They're not picky. And to help them find food, storks have very long, broad wings, and they can soar over great distances to look for things they like to eat. Um, Now, we talked last time about albatrosses and petrels and how they use soaring to kind of travel all over the world across the oceans. And the particular types of soaring that albatrosses and petrels use, I talked about before. One is called dynamic soaring, and that's basically when they turn into the wind and ride the wind high into the sky, and then they turn around so that the wind is at their tail, and they dive down very quickly towards the ocean surface, picking up speed, and then they use that momentum to turn back into the wind again and repeat the process. And doing this, they can travel for very, very long distances. Now, dynamic soaring does not work well on land. I think I mentioned this too. Basically, there are a lot of obstructions on land. You don't want to fly suddenly into a mountain or a tree or anything like that. So yeah, it only works out on the open ocean. So you don't see a lot of dynamic soaring in birds that soar over the land. Another type of soaring that albatrosses and petrels use is slope soaring, which is where there are big updrafts that are generated by a sudden, upwards shift in the terrain. Like if there's a big wave, there'll be big updrafts along it, and they'll use that to soar high into the sky and continue their travels. And that's something that land birds do use because there can be these big updrafts forming on the sides of mountains or canyons, and that's something that birds soaring on land can make use of. But there's also a third kind of soaring that is very common among land birds, including storks, and that is thermal soaring. And this is when there are these big columns of warm air rising from the ground, and because the sun heats up the ground, it causes these warm currents to generate. And this is the reason why kind of around midday is a pretty good time to go and look for birds of prey, because birds of prey are also thermal soaring birds, or at least many of them are. And when the sun has heated up the ground sufficiently to generate these very strong thermals, you often see birds of prey flying around up high in the sky using those thermals. Now, thermal soaring and dynamic soaring require somewhat different kinds of wings to do well. So we saw last time in albatrosses and petrels have these really long and narrow wings, and these are very good wings for generating lift. Um, in fact, people have calculated that if a vulture had wings that are shaped like those of an albatross, it would actually be able to generate even more lift than what an actual vulture can attain. But despite that, Thermal soaring birds don't tend to have albatross-like wings, and the storks certainly don't. And why is that? So in thermal soaring birds, the wings are also very long because they do need to, have a lot of surface area to support the weight of these birds in flight. But instead of being very long and slender and narrow with sharp tips, um, they tend to be much more broad. And the reason for that is because basically the lift in a thermal is strongest near the center of the thermal, and that's why thermal soaring birds tend to fly in these circling motions. They're kind of soaring around and around and around within a thermal, and then eventually when they get far enough, they will kind of get off one thermal and then ride the next one, and then they can continue this over and over again. And if you want to stay at the center of a thermal, you need to be able to turn sharply. You need to be able to make very tight circles. And that's when having a super long and narrow wing is not so helpful because, as you might imagine, if you're making tight turns and you have a very long and narrow wing, you're putting a lot of stress on that wing because it is so long and sharp. But if you have broader wings, that allows you to turn more easily. And so that is why thermal soaring birds have these long and broad wings, not sharp, narrow ones. And so this is the type of wing that storks have, and they use these on their travels and also for migration too, because some of the species, like the white stork, they migrate between Europe and Africa. They breed up in Europe. That's why you see photos of them kind of building nests on people's chimneys and things like that. They're doing that in Europe. And then they winter down in Africa. So yeah, that's a thermal soaring, which is a very efficient way for a lot of large land birds to get around. And this is not the last time we'll see thermal soaring in this episode. Let's see. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk about some of the extinct storks. Some of the best, probably at least the most spectacular stork fossils that are known are fossils of the genus Leptoptilos, which is the genus of marabou storks and their close relatives. And so one of the biggest species that is known from the fossil record, and there are several of these giant kind of marabou stork relatives that we know mostly from the Pleistocene, is this one. And in fact, it has actually made a cameo appearance before on our show, hasn't it?
That's right. Yeah, when we were talking about our good friend Homo floresiensis.
That's right, and that one is pictured on this slide as well. This is Leptoptilos robustus from the Pleistocene of Flores in Indonesia, so one of the islands of Indonesia, and that is, of course, the home of Homo floresiensis as well, or was until recently. So the size comparison chart that we're seeing here is Leptoptilos robustus compared to Homo floresiensis. That is not a modern human, but nonetheless, Leptoptilos robustus is a big bird. Like it's something like estimated at 1.8 meters tall. So that's like a modern human-sized bird and taller than many modern humans, including myself. It is thought that Leptoptilos robustus might have been flightless, or at least had reduced flight capabilities, because we don't have much of its wings, but we do have some, and they seem to be smaller than we'd expect for a stork of that size. Not to mention, it seems to have bones that have thicker bone walls than in other storks. And so it might have had like reduced flight capabilities and just mostly got around by walking, which is a pretty common thing for island birds to do. It would have been interesting to see how they interacted with Homo floresiensis. It's kind of interesting that in European kind of folklore, at least, white storks are, bringers of babies. They're the
That's
ones.
right.
Yeah. I suspect Homo floresiensis would have seen Leptoptilos robustus quite differently.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but definitely people capitalize on that on those potential relationships quite a bit in internet memes and things. I've seen, you've probably seen it too. Like how did Homo floresiensis get to Flores? And it's like storks brought them there by flying them there.
Oh, I
Yeah.
honestly, I don't think I've seen that
Oh,
one,
really?
but I'll
Yeah.
have
Okay.
to.
I guess I'll have to find it and link it in the description.
Yeah,
Yeah.
please do.
Yeah. It's a funny thing for sure.
Funny.
Of course, just to be clear, that's a joke. No scientist actually thinks that that happened, um, but even so, it's pretty funny to think about. Um, and there have been a number of other kind of giant Leptoptilus species known from the fossil record. There's a really big one called Leptoptilus luai from the Pleistocene of China, which might be the biggest one we know of, and that one might have still been able to fly. It's quite hard to compare sizes with these birds because they don't always have like overlapping bones. We don't always have the same bones from all the different species. But from the ones that we do have, it seems like Leptoptilus luai from the Pleistocene of China might be the biggest one. Um, and there was also another Indonesian species called Leptoptilus titan that was also quite big, although I think it's
Ooh.
supposed to be smaller than Robustus. Um,
Hmm.
and interesting thing about kind of the association between Leptoptilus robustus and Homo floresiensis is that it seems that the genus Leptoptilus it has some association with hominins and has for a while. Like my supervisor Daniel Field, he wrote a paper about the bird fossils that can be found at the type locality of a Australopithecus annamensis. And it turns out that one of the birds that can be found there is a species of Leptoptilus. so,
Oh wow.
yeah. And of course, we do know that marabou storks today like to hang around near human settlements and feed on, like, refuse and other things that people throw away. So, could this have been a kind of long-standing, relationship between our lineage and these storks? It's a very hard to test, but it's not unreasonable. Certainly, both of us would have been scavengers out on the African plains, and potentially things that we left behind could have been food for these storks. So, yeah, we might not think they look pretty a lot of the time, but it seems like we might have had their companionship for a long time. So
Absolutely.
that is yeah, definitely quite interesting. And further back still, from the Miocene of France, there was an extinct stork called Graulevis, which is known for some pretty decent fossils for a bird fossil. Um, that seems to also have been a close relative of the marabou storks and their relatives. So this particular lineage of storks has a pretty decent fossil record. And we also do have some fossils from some of the other stork genera too, but they often tend to be pretty fragmentary. So yeah, but even so, they're out there. Do you have anything else to add about storks?
Well, I was going to say to kind of like go back to an earlier thing you were talking about.
Yeah,
So we have some relatively large birds
right.
that fly using thermals for the
Hmm.
most part, and some of them like to scavenge too.
Yeah,
Now, that kind of sounds like another group of birds
it
that
sure
have
does.
historically been thought to be allied to the storks.
Hmm.
Am I right on that, Albert?
Yeah, you are right. You are right. Yes, and it has been historically suggested that, in particular, New World vultures are closely related to storks. And like even today, you will hear people repeating this: that New World vultures are not closely related to the other vultures; they are closely related to storks. But you will notice that I did not mention vultures at all in my kind of overview of Pelecanimorph phylogeny, or like at any point during while talking about this waterbird clade, and that is because now we have very strong evidence, especially from the genetic data, that New World vultures are not closely related to the storks at all. In fact, we will be covering New World vultures in the next episode of the series, not this one. Um, but it was a historical hypothesis, and there seemed to be evidence for it. And in some ways, it does appear to make sense. They both do include scavenging birds with these like kind of sparsely feathered heads and use thermals to travel. They also both, interesting enough, um, they will urinate on their own legs to keep cool. Um, so I guess just so people know, typically in birds, the urine is basically a white pasty stuff you find alongside their poo. So that is birds don't tend to produce a lot of very liquid urine like we do. Um, you often see like storks or vultures with their legs kind of stained white, and that's because they will pee on their own legs to keep cool, which is kind of disgusting, but also pretty interesting an adaptation. Um, because being unfeathered, the legs are one of the best places for birds to shed heat from, and so by peeing on them, they kind of reinforce that kind of effect. So that's pretty neat. um, but despite all these similarities, it seems that these commonalities between storks and New World vultures are convergent features and not because of a close relationship. So you can see why people were misled for quite a time. But please stop saying that New World vultures are close to storks because we now know that they are not. Yeah, and as for what they are closely related to, well, I think I'll save that story for next episode. Now,
Excellent.
yeah. Let's go to the next major lineage of the Pelecanimorphs. These are the Suliforms. Now, Suliforms, they are known from since the Eocene to the Holocene. There's a very early kind of Eocene species from like Southeast Asia. Um, and it is called a Protoplottus, and it is known from an essentially complete skeleton of something that looks kind of like a cormorant or maybe an anhinga, but it is not a very well studied specimen, unfortunately. So yeah, I don't think like there's basically any kind of recent paper that goes into detail about its morphology or tries to figure out what kind of a Suliform might have been. So we don't know a whole lot about it, sadly, but it probably is potentially quite informative about Suliform evolution. So hopefully someone gets a chance to look at it some more. Yeah, that is a Protoplottus from Sumatra. Now, in terms of the living diversity of Suliforms, it turns out that it's not a surprise that they are all closely related. They have a lot of unusual features that pretty much all of them share, and so for a long time they've already been considered to be closely related to one another, and so it wasn't a surprise to find that all of these guys form a clade. The surprise was that pelicans don't belong to this group, but we'll get to pelicans later. For now, let's take a look at the Suliforms specifically. I chose this picture specifically of a gannet because it shows off some of these Suliform features pretty well. So first of all, Suliforms have toady palmate feet, and we've talked about this feature in the last episode, and that is birds that have webbing between all four of their toes. So in a typical web-footed bird, the webbing goes between the three forward-pointing toes. So that's what you see in a duck, for example. So the three forward-pointing toes are joined with webbing, but the kind of the hallux, the innermost toe, is left out of the webbing. But in a Suliform, all of the toes are joined by webbing, and you can see that in the gannet here. You can see between all four of its toes, there's large expanses of webbing right there. Now, we saw this previously in the tropic birds, which were formerly thought to be closely related to the Suliforms, and this is one of the reasons why. But we now know that Suliforms and tropic birds are not closely related. Tropic birds are kind of way outside of this group within the waterbird clade. So yeah, convergent evolution strikes again. Something else that Suliforms tend to have is a naked throat pouch. Unfortunately, this is one of the features that is not all that visible in this photo. In fact, it's not all that visible in gannets, but they do have one. But if you look at a cormorant or another type of boobie, or of course, if you look at a male frigatebird with a big red throat pouch, it's quite obvious that there is a kind of a throat flap there. And they often use the throat pouch or the throat for cooling down themselves. So they'll engage in kind of behavior called gular fluttering, and they vibrate the throat pouch very quickly, so they can kind of evaporate moisture from the inside of their mouth, and that helps them keep themselves cool. A very odd feature that Suliforms have is that they don't have external nostril openings, and you can see this in the gannet here. So it has these kind of dark markings along the sides of its beak, but it doesn't have any actual openings to its nostrils. Yeah, this is very odd, and why they don't have this is oddly enough not that well understood. Now you will see quite a lot of sources will say things like it helps because things like boobies when they feed, they dive down from the sky and plunge dive into the water to grab food, and that not having nostrils prevents the water from shooting up their nose or something like that, and it probably does help with that, but not all Suliforms feed that way. That's pretty much something that the boobies do. So it's not clear that this was the ancestral kind of function of this or significance of this feature. Yeah, and it is otherwise not particularly well understood why they do not have these external nostril openings, but they don't. And yes, this does mean that they have to breathe through their mouth. I've read like wildlife rehab manuals that talk about, oh, if you're taking care of a suliform or a pelican, which also share this feature, don't keep the mouth sealed shut, or else the bird will not be able to breathe. Yeah, so very odd feature.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right. Yeah, we'd love to know more about the significance of that. Um, Also, Suliforms have an extra kind of beak plate at the corner of the mouth. We talked a little bit about kind of the beak sheath in birds previously, like how in a lot of birds the sheath of the beak it is kind of all fused together into one continuous kind of surface. But in fact, developmentally, the beak is actually several different plates kind of next to each other. And in Suliforms, there is an additional plate that other birds don't have in the back of the upper beak at the corner of the mouth. And you can kind of see this in the gannet here. So, that little almost triangular structure underneath its eye and behind the rest of the beak, that is the kind of the extra beak plate at the corner of its mouth, which is something that Suliforms have, but other birds don't. Um, and the tarsometatarsus in Suliforms tends to be very short, and the tarsometatarsus is the fusion of the long bones in the foot with some of the ankle bones. So that's, yeah, the kind of the long foot bone in a bird. Um, and in Suliforms, they have big webbed feet, but the rest of the foot, the tarsometatarsus, tends to be very short in most of these taxa. And we will see one particular group later that has taken this to sort of an extreme. And also relating to feet, Suliforms incubate their eggs with their feet, or at least many of them do. Other than the frigatebirds, the other Suliforms will incubate their eggs by either standing on top of them or kind of putting their eggs over on top of their feet. So either way. Um, Now, most birds, when they are incubating their eggs, they have a little naked patch on their underside. Basically, they develop a brood patch. This is called, and then they will kind of nestle their eggs down into the brood patch, and being a naked surface that allows them to transfer their body heat to the eggs effectively. But most of the Suliforms do not have a brood patch, and instead they use their feet for this function. So that's kind of odd. um, so yeah, lots and lots of features that unite this group. Do you have anything to add before we go to the specifics?
Not really, no.
All right, so let's continue on and meet the different groups of Suliforms. So the first up are the frigatebirds, and this is an amazing group. This is one of my favorite group of birds because they are so odd and amazing. There are only 5 living species currently, but they can be found all over the tropical oceans. And I'll get to in a moment why they're found in specifically the tropical oceans. Now, they have the lowest wing loading of any bird, and what that means is wing loading is the amount of mass, so essentially body weight, although technically they're not the same thing, amount of mass relative to the wing area. So if you have a low wing loading, that means you have a very large wings with very big surface area compared to your body size. And if you have a high wing loading, you have a very heavy body compared to your wing size. And frigatebirds have by far the lowest wing loading of any bird, so they're built super, super light. In fact, if you took all the feathers of a frigatebird and weighed it, it would weigh more than their skeleton. So that's how lightly built they are. Now that is that is actually not unique to frigatebirds. Some of the other soaring birds are also like this. Like I'd seen a demonstration. Someone did this with like an eagle, for example, weighing the feathers and the skeleton, and turns out the feathers actually weigh more. But nonetheless, it's one of the features that frigatebirds have that make them very, very light. And probably the reason for this is that they are super aerial birds. Like they spend most of their time flying out over the ocean. And people have recorded them basically staying in flight continuously for months. Yeah, they can just keep going and going and going. I think what's even more remarkable about this is that frigatebirds, even though they are seabirds, I mean, they feed from the ocean, but they can't touch the ocean, sort of. Uh, like, they have very poorly waterproofed feathers. So if they actually landed in the water, they would quickly get waterlogged and would not be able to take off again, or at least would find it very difficult to take off again, and would most likely drown and yeah die. So they will pretty much never actually land on the ocean by choice, never. So what do they do instead? Well, what they do is that they will instead catch prey near the ocean surface. So while they're flying, they'll fly down, see fish swimming near the surface, and grab them from the water without actually touching the water. Besides using their beak. Um, Something else they will do is that they will steal from other seabirds. So a little bit like the skuas we talked about during the shorebirds episode. They'll chase after other seabirds, harass them until they drop the fish they have caught, and then they will swoop down and catch the fish in midair. And to help them with this, sea frigatebirds are absolutely incredible flyers, as you might have already gotten a sense of. They also like to catch a flying fish because, of course, flying fish, one of their main defenses from underwater predators, so larger fish or dolphins and things like that, they will jump out of the ocean and glide for quite a distance through the air before landing back in the water and hopefully, outpace their pursuers. But of course, leaping out of the water puts them in range of the frigatebirds, and so frigatebirds are very good at capitalizing on that kind of opportunity. Um, there is an amazing sequence in the documentary The Hunt by the BBC. So one of my favorite nature documentaries, and that's probably one of my favorite sequences from that documentary. That's showing flying fish being chased by Dorado. The Dorado are these large open ocean predatory fish. They're also called dolphin fish, oddly enough. Very distinctive looking. You also see them sold as mahi mahi, which is their Hawaiian name, and people like to eat them.
Delicious.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I've certainly had them before. They're good, but but in the documentary, the Dorado are the hunters, and they're going after the flying fish. And so the flying fish, of course, they jump out of the water to try and escape from them. But these frigate birds just swoop down and try to catch the flying fish while they're in the air, and so the flying fish are kind of caught between two hells, basically. Or between the devil and the deep blue sea was what the narration called it, which is quite appropriate. Um, so yeah, that's a really cool sequence. First of all, well, it makes you feel really bad for flying fish, but uh, when I watch that sequence, it's just so amazing because every animal in that sequence is so graceful and so good at what it does. It's just one of those wow, the world is amazing kind of things. So I love that. I love that sequence, and I think it's actually available on one of the BBC YouTube channels to watch. So I will link it in the description. But in any case, yeah, the frigate birds, are aerial acrobats. They have to be so that they can feed from the ocean without touching the ocean, which is yeah, almost paradoxical. Like, how can an animal like this exist? But they do. Um, and so let's get to how they're actually able to remain in flight for so long. And this is because, as it turns out, frigate birds are thermal soarers. That's interesting because we just talked about how a lot of the seabirds tend to use a very different kind of soaring, dynamic soaring. Um, Instead, frigate birds are thermal soarers, so they can remain aloft on thermals for very, very long periods of time. And in fact, what they will do is they will observe clouds. So where clouds are gathering, or cumulus clouds are forming, tends to be where the updrafts are strongest. And so they will actually fly up into the clouds, like 4,000 meters into the air, and just hang out in the clouds, flying up there without having to get near the ocean when they're traveling. As far as we know, they're the only birds that are known to do this. Um, Now, the thing is, thermals, of course, form when there are these, rising warm currents. And so over the ocean, thermals only form uh, where it's warm enough, and that is the tropical oceans, and that is why frigate birds are restricted to the tropics. Um, yeah, so when you go too far away from the tropics, the water does not get warm enough to form thermals, and so you don't get frigate birds there. But anywhere within the tropics and the other adjacent areas, frigate birds can travel to and do so pretty much effortlessly. Um, they can also sleep in flight, and this is interesting because they are one of the few birds that have actually been confirmed to actually sleep in flight. So we talked previously about swifts, which are also absolutely incredible flyers that can remain aloft for months. So frigate birds and swifts actually are the only birds um, we know of that can remain in flight for months at a time. Um, and so it is often suspected that swifts sleep on the wing because otherwise, when are they going to sleep? Um, but we haven't been, as far as I know, we haven't actually recorded them doing this, like um, not like we have for the frigate birds. So what people have done for frigate birds is they've actually implanted these little data logging devices into their skull. So they perform little surgery on them and implant a tracking device on them. Um, and that measures their brain activity. And so, looking at this brain activity, you can tell when the bird is asleep versus when it is not. And lo and behold, when people took these data trackers off the frigate birds, um, it turns out that frigate birds will nap in the air. So, yeah, that's pretty neat.
Wow.
Yep.
Now, you mentioned that frigate birds are like strong aerial flyers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how are they on land?
Yeah. So frigate birds have extremely reduced feet. Um, so I said that the tarsometatarsus being very short is kind of a suliform kind of thing, but in frigate birds it's ridiculously short. Like I didn't show a picture here, but yeah, the foot is super super short, so they can't walk basically. Um, yeah. Now, pretty much all their feet are good for is for perching. They are able to perch in trees like most of the other pelecanimorphs are, but and they will nest in trees. They'll gather sticks and build a nest in the trees. But yeah, they cannot walk on the ground because their feet are too short. Yeah, super super aerially specialized. And in that regard, they're kind of similar to the swifts too. Swifts don't have as short feet proportionate to the body, but their feet are so adapted for like clinging to vertical surfaces that they can't really walk very well on land. Um, so yeah, you won't typically see a frigate bird land on the ocean by choice. You probably won't see them land on like flat ground either. They prefer to perch in somewhere elevated like a tree. So I guess this is going to turn into me complaining about Disney movies again.
I think I know where you're going with
Yeah,
this.
yeah, in Moana, right? There's a scene with frigate birds. Yeah, it's just a short scene. It's not. It's not. They didn't get a whole lot of screen time, but there's a scene where I think young Moana is saving the baby sea turtles from frigate birds, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now, frigate birds do feed on baby sea turtles. I remember this very well from watching Kratz Creatures when I was a kid. They had an episode about sea turtles hatching and all the predators that eat them and things like that. That was
Oh
fun.
yeah.
Yeah, but anyways, but when frigate birds hunt for sea turtles, they do it like they do with pretty much any other prey item, is that they fly down and grab them from the air and then take off. Whereas in the movie, they showed the frigate birds actually landing on the beach and then walking around, and yeah, that's something they don't do. Um, but yeah, still, it's still a fun movie though. Don't let me put you off it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's probably one of my favorites from recent years.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, and I do enjoy seeing frigate birds getting any kind of pop culture attention at all, because of course they're somewhat obscure. Like people know what they look like perhaps, but not necessarily much else about them. Famously, frigate birds have an expandable red throat pouch, and you can see that in this one here, where it is not expanded currently because it's not doing courtship. But this is how you'll typically see them pictured in like books and things like that. Photographs of them tend to show them in mating display. The males will gather in big groups and they all inflate their big throat pouch like a balloon and kind of display to the passing females. So that's the way that they do courtship. Let's see, what else? Well, I actually have a frigate bird sighting story, interestingly enough,
Ooh.
and it was memorable. Like that is definitely probably in my top 5 kind of wildlife sightings I've had, because it was yeah, it was amazing. Okay, so yeah, let me tell you about it. So that was in northern Taiwan. So I was visiting my family members in Taiwan, and we went for a beach down along the shoreline, right at the northernmost tip of Taiwan, in fact. So yeah, that was interesting landmark. Um, and as always, I always carry my binoculars pretty much everywhere I go. But on that day, we hadn't really seen many birds around, so it was it was an enjoyable enough walk, but not much unusual sights to report. But then my mom pointed out there's a bird soaring over there in the distance. And I looked at it through my binoculars, and it was this long winged soaring bird. Um, and of course, first thought you tend to get when you see a long winged soaring bird at the beach is, oh, a gull. But I kept watching it through my binoculars, and it currently, well, when I was watching it, it had its back turned to me, so I couldn't see the shape of its tail or the shape of its head or anything like that. I could just tell that it was soaring and it had long wings. And I kept watching it through my binoculars, and I kept feeling that something was off, that it probably wasn't a gull because first of all, it didn't flap its wings at all during the entire time I was watching it. And gulls are excellent soarers; they're excellent flyers, but even they often will, flap every now and then when they're flying. Um, and the other thing was this bird looked really big and dark, and of course gulls tend to have, big patches of white on them. And I tried to think, maybe it's in silhouette form or something, but no, it does look really big and dark for a gull. Now, eventually, the bird started to turn around so that I could see it from the side, and I could see that it had these long tail feathers, as you can see on the photo here. Yeah, frigate birds have those long tail feathers, and yeah, okay. And then it was still very far in the distance, so I still wasn't like 100% sure. But I told my mom, I think that might be a frigate bird, and it's not entirely unexpected to see frigate birds in Taiwan. They're not like oh you have to report this to I don't know all the birding groups and tell all the birders to come and see this rare bird, but they're also not like super common either. They're not like you can just go out to suitable habitat and I guarantee that you will definitely get a sighting of one. They're not that predictable, and so I was starting to get pretty excited. And now, even more fortunately, the bird started to turn towards the shoreline, and then very soon it was flying just above us, like very close to us. And then at that point, there was basically no doubt it was a frigate bird, and oh gosh, it was so amazing. Like there's no other word for it.
Wow.
Like okay, so it was bigger in terms of its wingspan. It was bigger than any gull I'd ever seen. It looked huge, even though, of course, I knew it was a very lightly built bird. Um, and yeah, it just didn't have to flap its wings basically at all. Like occasionally, maybe it would kind of angle its wings downward and to catch a little bit of lift and things like that. But like overall, it just hung in the air like a kite. Um, like you look at that and you have no doubt at all that this is an animal that lives in the air. Like the sky is its habitat. It's just incredible that such a thing exists. And then, of course, I pulled out my field guide to try and ID what specific kind of frigate bird it was. It can be pretty tricky because this is not an adult male. It was probably an immature individual, and immature frigate birds can be quite difficult to tell apart. But as far as I could tell, and I also showed a photo to my supervisor, who is a very experienced birder. Well, what do you think this is? And we both agreed that it seemed to have been a lesser frigate bird, which is, as it turns out, the smallest species of living frigate bird. And even then, it was already visibly much bigger than any gull I'd ever seen in terms of its wingspan. So yeah, yeah, it was so cool. That was definitely one of my favorite wildlife sightings ever.
That's so amazing. Well, I'm very happy that you got the chance to see this bird.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Thank you.
I have a sort of similar
Oh yeah.
birding story, but I'll save it for when we get to the
Ah,
Pecaformes.
okay, okay, yeah, sure thing. But yes, yeah, definitely one of my favorite sightings. And of course, frigate birds have always been pretty high on my list of birds that I would like to see. So I was very, very happy about that. Yeah, of course, I still would love to go to somewhere where they are actually abundant and see a bunch of them all at once. But no, that was definitely an amazing experience. So yeah, frigate birds are great. I like them a lot. Let's see. Do you have anything else to add about frigate birds before we go to the fossil ones?
Not particularly. Unfortunately, I haven't
Yeah,
had the opportunity to see one.
right. Well, I hope you do someday because amazing creatures. Um, the frigate bird fossil record, it turns out it's not super good because, as you might imagine, these super lightly built birds, their skeletons probably don't preserve very well. So we don't really have a whole lot of good frigate bird fossils, but we do have these three species from the Eocene, from the genus Limnofrigata, that have been preserved from North American deposits. And specifically, two of them are known from the Green River Formation in the United States. And the Green River Formation is, as you've probably heard several times by now in this series, excellent for preserving bird fossils. And so we do have these complete, basically stem frigate bird skeletons from these sites. And so here's one of the specimens, and oftentimes the feathers are preserved too. And this is a this is pretty interesting. So they are recognizably frigate birds, but they do lack a lot of the hyper specialized kind of features that modern frigate birds have. You'll be able to see here, kind of in the upper right corner, you can see the hind limbs and also the hip girdle of this limnofrigata here. So you can see where the toes are attaching to the tarsometatarsus, right? And you can see how short that tarsometatarsus is. But as short as this is, Limnofrigata does not have relatively as short a tarsometatarsus as a modern frigate bird. So that tells you something about how short the feet are in modern frigate birds. Yeah, and its wings are pretty long. You can see the long bones of the wings over to the left mostly. But they're still not proportionately as long as in a modern frigate bird. So yeah, this is a you could tell that this is sort of it's very frigate bird like, but it's still not quite like a modern one. And something else unusual about it is that it was found in a freshwater environment. So it seems like these stem frigate birds were living alongside lakes and things, and not near the ocean like the modern ones do. So it seems to have been something different that Limnofrigata was doing. Now, whether or not this was ancestral to frigate birds or even to all Suliforms in general, it's hard to say. People have speculated that maybe Suliforms are ancestrally freshwater birds that moved into the ocean later on. Well, which is possible because if you look at their close relatives, if you look at the storks and a lot of the Pelecaniforms, a lot of those are freshwater birds. So it could be that the Suliforms entered the marine environment later in their evolutionary history. But yeah, otherwise, other than the Nofragata, which to be fair is known for very excellent skeletons, we don't really have a good frigate bird record.
This particular genus,
Mm,
this is another one of those fossil birds that I learned about very early on,
mm, mm.
because it showed up in the Macmillan Encyclopedia that
Yeah. Mm.
I think a lot of our viewers probably know about. Of course, it looked nothing like a frigate bird. They kind of drew it like a seagull
Mm.
almost.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess ecologically, it probably would have been somewhat gull-like. The original describer did speculate that maybe it still swam and stuff, and well, it wasn't so averse to actually landing in the water like a modern frigate bird, um, which seems to be indicated by some of its hind limb features. But yeah, definitely a very interesting bird, very important for understanding of kind of frigate bird evolution. Um, yeah, definitely hope we do find more frigate bird fossils in the future, but that will probably take exceptional kind of preservation. All right. Do you have anything else to add before we go on?
Nope.
All right. Let's go to the next group, the boobies. Yeah. So yeah, often they're listed as the boobies and the gannets, but the gannets are nested within the taxa that we call boobies. So I'm okay with calling all of them boobies. Um, uh, I guess the thing is, well, for one, this is one of those birds that whose names cause people to snicker at. Um,
Mm.
but also, in terms of names, this is a group of birds that we haven't been very kind to, um, because the name booby, I think, is widely thought to have come from the Spanish word for a foolish person. Uh,
Oh,
um, yeah, and also the gannet genus Morris also basically means the same thing. So people thought these were stupid, foolish birds, um, and probably the reason for that is that they're not they tend not to be very wary of predators, and of course people tend to encounter them on land where they're nesting, and they tend to nest in places that are, like a lot of the other seabirds we've already talked about. They tend to nest in places where there aren't a lot of land predators, and so that keeps their nest safe from predators, but also means that they don't have to worry about predators attacking them, and so people could just go up to them and kill them if they wanted to, uh, and so they were thought to be stupid, which is rather unfortunate. Um, but despite that, boobies are very good at what they do. Now, there are about 10 living species of boobies, and they're primarily found in coastal oceans. They also prefer a warm climate, although the gannets will often live in temperate oceans as well. Um, and unlike things like the petrels and the albatrosses and tropic birds, you won't find boobies out on the open ocean that often. A lot of the times they do commute back and forth between the shore and the ocean, or even if they spend some of the year on the ocean, they'll mostly spend it in the shallower regions. But even so, they are quite superbly adapted seabirds, and probably the most spectacular thing that they do is the way they feed. So they feed by plunge diving from great heights. And we've seen before other birds that feed by plunge diving from the air, like things like terns within the shorebirds and also the tropic birds. They'll fly around above the water, and then when they see something they want to eat, they'll quickly plunge down into the sea, grab it, and then fly back up. We've seen that before. But what they don't do is that they don't plunge from as great a height as the boobies do, and they don't dive to as deep a depth as the boobies do. So boobies can often dive from heights of 100 meters high in the air. Like, how's that for a high dive record? Um, yeah, yeah. I looked up human high dive records for when I saw this kind of statistic, and yeah, none of them come close to that. I can tell you that. um, so they'll plunge down from a great height, and when they do that, they basically kind of extend their wings out behind them and align them with their bodies. It makes more sense when you actually see video or photo of them doing this. But yeah, they'll kind of stretch out their wings behind them, uh, and then they'll stick their necks very straight out, and basically turning their entire body into an arrow or a missile shaped kind of structure, and then shoot straight down into the ocean. And then doing this, they can shoot down to depths to about 10 meters deep right from the get-go. And let me tell you, I've been in a swimming pool that is 5 meters deep, and that swimming pool already looked very terrifyingly deep. I'll tell you that. Diving straight to 10 meters down, I cannot imagine. Like, that is that is intense. That is intense, especially from a height of 100 meters. Um, and then once they're down there, they can swim down further to depths of about like 20 meters or so, and then continue pursuing prey down there before they come back up. And so doing this, they can get to prey that other plunge diving seabirds cannot. Um, and a lot of the kind of wildlife documentaries where they show, a bunch of marine predators just kind of destroying a school of little fish, unfortunately for the fish, um, uh, you can often see boobies kind of gathering and partaking in these hunts, and they'll just shoot down from the sky like arrows and just snatching fish from the school. Um, it's quite a spectacular sight. Unfortunately, I have not been able to see um, boobies in the wild before. Theoretically I could, because northern gannets, they do nest on the coasts of the United Kingdom, but yeah, I haven't been to the beaches much over here, so I haven't had a chance to see any of these. Have you?
Me, no, I haven't
Mm,
had that opportunity either.
yeah.
The My dad has an interesting
Oh
story.
yeah.
It, it's silly. It's
Yeah,
very
yeah,
silly,
yeah.
no boobies show up at all.
Right.
It's one of those things, I guess, alluding to what you were talking about, the kind of unfortunate treatment
Yeah.
we've given to these birds regarding their names.
Hmm.
Um, this was before he retired. I think he was in the Coast Guard,
Mm-hmm.
really young, and we was in Hawaii. This is before we had lived there,
Yeah.
and he was just hanging out on the beach, taking in the sights. And then this old man shows up, and he had been maybe his late 60s or so. He had binoculars in the hat, and he had all the gear, and he was just like super excited. He was clearly a birder
Yeah.
and into birding, but he was like, oh, like it's like a football game, like when you kick a
Right.
goal, screaming. He was like that.
Right.
So he goes up and he's like, hey, young man, have you seen the boobies? I'm trying to find the boobies. And that's just there, like, because he didn't know that boobies were birds.
Right. Right.
So he had to get that clarification, and then eventually they had a good laugh about it. But that's one of those stories he used to always tell, and it just cracks me
Right.
up.
Right. Oh, that that's pretty funny. Yeah. Well, there we go. Yes. Yeah. Kind of the humorous value of the name there. Um, but yes, indeed. Yeah. Unfortunately, I haven't really spent enough time in the warm kind of oceans where boobies like to live. So yeah, I haven't really seen them myself. But nonetheless, I would like to. Um, and speaking of their kind of feeding style, I guess this is dangerous, as you might imagine. This kind of you definitely wouldn't want to jump down from a height of 100 meters into the water. And yeah, even though boobies have all of these adaptations, like they can make themselves very streamlined, and they have all these air sacs to cushion themselves to protect themselves when they're doing this, it can go wrong. Um, like I've seen a tweet from someone who was watching gannets feeding, and then they said that they saw one gannets dive down, and probably it kind of miscalculated the angle a little bit, and it broke its neck on impact and died immediately. Yeah.
That's rough.
Yeah, yeah, it's absolutely. um, so yeah, kind of daredevil birds we're talking about here. Um, and I've also seen a very similar kind of site in a documentary. I think it was one of the BBC ones too, but I think it was Nature's Greatest Spectacles or something like that. Anyways, I think that is also on YouTube, so I'll try to find it and link it.
Oh,
But
Nature's Most Amazing Events.
might have been that. Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, yeah. I think they also showed kind of gannets feeding in this spectacular kind of fashion, but one of them like makes a mistake and pays for it. Yeah, not easy watching, by the way, just to warn the listeners out there. But yeah. So yeah, can can be dangerous. Nonetheless, obviously it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen often enough to make a difference in terms of their overall species survivorship. So nonetheless, they are very good at what they do. Um, all right, let's talk a little bit about fossil boobies. So from the Miocene onwards, there are actually quite a few different fossil boobies that have been named, especially from North American and European coastlines. Um, but we do have some very early kind of Eocene fossils that might belong to the booby lineage, and one of these is Mesolostega from the Eocene of Germany, and this is another one of those mesol fossils, one of the other really good sites for fossil birds. Um, so something else unusual about this is that mesol is also kind of a lake environment. So this might also be implying that Mesolostega was unlike living boobies living in a freshwater kind of environment. Now we only have this kind of pretty beat up skull that is shown over here, so it's not entirely clear that it is a booby, or it could be some other kind of bird. But nonetheless, what we do have is fairly booby-like, so I think it's pretty plausible that it is a stem booby. Um, I guess just as an example of one of the other unusual boobies in the fossil record is Ramphastasula from the Miocene of Peru, and it's actually known from two species from the Miocene of Peru. And we can see here that the beak of Ramphastasula is not so much like the beak of a modern booby. Um, yeah, that's kind of odd. So the very tip of the beak to the left is actually kind of worn off. So probably in life it would have had a sharper tip, but nonetheless it has kind of like this almost a toucan-like bill. That's what gave it its name, Ramphastusula, which means a toucan booby. Um, Instead of a kind of very long and sharp bill that you typically see in the modern boobies. Of course, the modern form is very well adapted to plunge diving from height and kind of penetrating the water surface. So it seems like maybe Ramphastusula was not doing this kind of plunge diving behavior. Now, what it was doing is still remains to be figured out. But perhaps it was only making shallow plunge dives like a tern or a tropic bird would, and not like a super diving from a super huge height like the modern ones do. Interestingly enough, there have been modern boobies observed with deformed bills that end up being shaped quite a lot like that of Ramphastusula, and they seem to survive okay through whatever means. So clearly, it can work for a booby. And I guess before anyone asks whether or not we're sure that Ramphastusula actually had this beak, and that this is not also a deformity we're observing in the fossil record, we have several specimens of Ramphastusula that all show this feature. So it does seem to be a genuine kind of trait of this species, of this genus rather. It adds to kind of the very rich kind of Miocene South American seabird diversity. We talked last time about some of the fossil penguins that lived around in that environment, and so yeah, clearly very rich ecosystem to sustain a lot of these marine predators. Um, I guess something else I didn't mention earlier is kind of display behavior in boobies. Like a lot of them, boobies have very brightly colored bare patches on the face and also on the feet for display. Um, Famously, the blue-footed boobies tend to do this kind of little dance. Certainly, the males do it, but the females also have those blue feet too. So there is evidence that both the males and females use the kind of the color of the feet to kind of assess the quality of potential partners. And so once again, we're seeing a sort of mutual sexual selection going on, where both sexes have ornaments and both sexes use the ornaments as kind of a way to assess mate quality. Um, yeah, I wonder if Ramphastusula that beak could have been the sort of display structure too. That would be interesting. Do you have anything else to add before we go on? Hmm.
Not particularly, no.
All right. Next slide. Okay, so the next group of Suliforms we're going to cover are the Anghingas. Now, the Anghingas have several other common names. One of these are the darters. Yeah, you'll see that pretty often in bird books and things. Probably referring to the darting motion in their neck, I'm assuming. And another one is snakebirds. Now, the reason they're called snakebirds is quite interesting. As you can see on the right here, they'll often swim with most of the body submerged and only the neck and head sticking up out of the water. And yeah, with a very serpentine kind of look, and that's why they're called snakebirds. So that's a pretty appropriate name for them. Oftentimes, specifically the North American species is called the Anghinga. But I like to call them Anghingas because it's a pretty distinctive name for them. Like the name darter is also used for some kinds of fish, for example. So, yeah. There are only 4 living species of Anghingas. There's one from the Americas, one from Africa, one from Asia, and one from Australia. I was able to see the Australian species quite a few times when I visited Australia for a Society of Vertebrate Paleontology in 2019. I see that gets brought up a lot in this series because I saw a lot of birds there. Um, but yeah, they're really cool looking. Have you seen Anghingas?
Yeah, this is actually one I've seen a lot of times
Yeah,
in Florida. I love these birds. They're so distinct,
right.
and I've seen them in flight,
Yeah.
and I have seen like their heads out of the water occasionally, and like that's how I can always tell. Like, oh, it's an anhinga.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They're really cool. Um, and they are primarily found in warmer regions of the world, tropics and subtropics, and usually in fresh water instead of the ocean. Um, and there is a reason why they're restricted to tropical and subtropical regions, which I'll get to soon. These are foot-propelled diving birds, so they'll swim underwater by kicking with their feet. Now, something very interesting about them is that their feathers are not waterproof. So when they are submerged in the water, they will actually get soaked, and then that helps them sink further down, into the water, and that's why they swim with their entire body submerged. Um, And like other diving birds, they also have like air sacs that don't extend into their bones and things like that. And so when they're under the water, what they'll do is they'll basically stalk their prey. It's quite interesting that they do this under the water. So they'll kind of get up very close to something they want to hunt and slowly approach them, and then suddenly they'll shoot their bill forward and grab them with that very long and sharp bill. So they'll typically catch prey by like kind of stabbing or harpooning them. Um, yeah, and they'll even like spread their wings under the water to create a bit of shade. And fish like to hang out in the shade sometimes. It's a good place to hide usually. But if they come into the shade of an anhinga, that is not so good for them. Yeah, and we'll see some other birds that do a similar kind of feeding strategy. But definitely the anhingas do this. Um, Now, kind of a trade-off with those the lack of waterproofing in their feathers is that, well, um, they need to dry off, first of all. So you'll often see them when they're not in the water, see them perched around and with their wings kind of spread out to the sides, and that's when they're drying their wings and from after they've gone for a swim. And so, because they get soaked doing this, that is the reason why they are only found in warm habitats. Because if they're, yeah, you might imagine that this probably wouldn't be so nice if they lived in a cold environment and they got soaked all the way down to their skin. Yeah, that would not be healthy for them, and so that is probably the reason why they're only found in the tropics and the subtropics. But nonetheless, it is a pretty effective way for them to swim around. Let's see some fossil anhingas on the next slide. Um, Anhingas have a pretty decent fossil record from the Miocene onward, although the oldest ones that we know of are Oligocene. Um, and something interesting that we see in the fossil record are giant anhingas. And yeah, so I've shown a few examples here. So on the left there, we're seeing the hip bones of several Anhinga species. So a modern Anhinga is B, and what you're looking at basically the hip girdle of an Anhinga. In birds, most of the bones in the hip girdle all fuse together. So the ischium and the ilium and the pubis, they're all fused into one big bone, and also fused to the hip vertebrae that run through them too. So they're fused into a big mass called the synsacrum. Um, and so you're looking at this big pelvic girdle mass here, and looking down from the top. So this is a top view of one in an Anhinga. And if you look on either side, there's this little kind of depression on either side of the hip, right? And then just behind that, you might be able to see this little hole in the side, a little notch in the side. And then behind that, the bones kind of stick out into this sort of sharp corner. There's a pair of those. So the little notch in front of the corner, that's basically the hip socket, region of the hip socket where the hind limb would attach. Um, okay, so those are sort of your landmarks for the hips of the Anhinga here, because next on to the right, you can see the hips of some of these giant fossil Anhingas. And now, since they are not complete, you don't see the complete structure like you can in the modern Anhinga, but you can still recognize those two sharp corners to the side, right, and in front of that the hip socket. That you can see it paired in the one in the middle, and on the one on the right, it only has the hip socket region on the left, whereas the side on the right has kind of worn away. But nonetheless, if you can recognize those kind of same landmark structures, you can tell how much bigger these fossil Anhingas are compared to a modern Anhinga, because these are shown to scale. So in the middle, we have a macro Anhinga from the Miocene of Argentina, and on the right, we have a Giganhinga from the Pliocene and Pleistocene of Uruguay. Yeah, these are huge birds. So I think like the modern Anhingas are around chicken sized ish, so moderately sized birds, but not massive. Whereas some of these fossil anhingas get up into turkey size to even bigger than that, to like the size of a swan or something like that. And on the size comparison on the right in the silhouette form, you can see a modern anhinga and gig anhinga and a human for scale. So yeah, these are huge birds. The biggest Enghinga known is one that is similar to Gigenghinga from the Miocene of Argentina, which is also known from rather scrappy remains, but enough to show that it is absolutely massive. I think it's estimated as at like 17 kilograms, something like that. So yeah, like the size of a really big swan. Some of these giant anhingas, they are known to have reduced forelimb proportions, so they might have been flightless or at least had reduced flight capabilities. But not all of them are known, or rather, we don't have like wing bones for all of them, so it's not clear that this was common to all of them. And in fact, they might not even form a clade, so there might have been like several lineages of these giant anhingas that all became supersized. Now, as you might have already noticed, most of these giant anhingas are particularly well known from South America, from the Miocene onwards, and they survive all the way to the early Pleistocene. But we do also know of anhingas that were bigger than modern anhingas from the Miocene of Europe and North America and Africa as well. So they were kind of all over the place. Now, it seems that from North America and Europe and Africa, these giant anhingas probably disappeared because of overall cooling of the climate. So we mentioned already how anhingas can only survive in rather warm environments. So probably the overall cooling throughout the Miocene eventually led to their extinction. But in the South America, giant anhingas hung on until the early Pleistocene at least, and so it is still not really clear to us why the giant anhingas did not survive in South America. So hopefully we eventually learn more about that. Um, but yeah, definitely a rather interesting chapter in Suliform evolution. Do you have any other thoughts?
The only thing I'll say is Gingang Hinga is like a perfect kaiju name. We're gonna see that movie, Hollywood.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, a giant anhinga would be pretty scary, I would say, with that harpoon like bill, and especially like if it was in the water, like yeah, and with that kind of stalking behavior that was mentioned before, like it's not even gonna, it's not something that's gonna like chase after you. It's gonna be something in murky water, you can't see a thing, and it's like this gigantic,
Yeah.
yeah. Oof, yeah, that could honestly make a pretty decent movie. Um, so, but probably knowing Hollywood, it's probably more likely going to be something really cheesy but yeah, we have Giganghinga and Macranhinga and Megaanghinga is a third one that I haven't mentioned yet. So yeah,
You get the whole trilogy right there.
right. So yeah, definitely some food for thought there. Now, finally, we are going to talk about on the next slide a group that is very closely related to the Anghingas, the cormorants. Now, the cormorants are very diverse. There are around 40 living species. Again, as always, depending on how you split them. But yeah, around 40 is pretty much the right ballpark. And unlike a lot of the other Suliforms that are relatively restricted in their geographic distribution, the cormorants can be found all over the world, in both coastal and freshwater environments. Uh, like the Anghingas, they're also foot-propelled divers that find prey underwater, and they'll actually like chase after prey underwater. They're kind of pursuit predators in that regard. And also similar to the Anghingas is that they have semi-permeable plumage. Now there is a difference there. I said semi-permeable here. Um, so it appears that in cormorants the feathers are not fully permeable, so they will get soaked to a point, but after that point, the feathers remain waterproof and they will still retain kind of an insulating air layer in their plumage. So, in this regard, cormorants kind of get the best of both worlds because they can kind of get soaked enough to help them sink, but not too soaked that they cannot survive in slightly chilly environments. And that is probably the reason they have such a wide distribution. Now, Interestingly, one species of cormorant, the flightless cormorant of the Galapagos, has, as its name suggests, become flightless. So that is another case of a diving bird that has lost flight capabilities. Um, and I guess something else worth mentioning is that because of this semi-permeable plumage, cormorants also have this wing drying behavior similar to the anghingas, and that's what you're seeing in the photo here with this little pied cormorant. Yeah, it's sitting around on the shore and drying its wings, and that's also the reason why they're mostly limited to coastal marine environments. Not they don't swim out into the open ocean like some of the other seabirds do, because they do still need to come back and dry off their feathers. But even so, they are a very successful group for sure. And because they are found all over the world, I think probably, I would imagine, like most people who have access to bodies of water probably seen them at some point. I know I certainly have. How about you?
Oh, I see these guys all the time.
Right.
They're probably the most common water bird besides like herons and gulls
Mhm.
that I see wherever I go. I mean, their wing, their open wing kind of
Yeah.
sitting thing, like that's like iconic.
Yeah,
You
right.
know, I usually see them as such, and for me, like they're really pretty birds.
They are,
Like
yeah.
they're kind of ungainly, but it's like in a charming way.
Right, right.
They carry a presence about themselves that's
Yes.
like they're kind of like the masters of the shore, even though
Right.
they're average birds like everybody else. But um, no, definitely a very common bird for me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I imagine quite a few people are probably familiar with these, and I definitely do see them around here too. We are the most common species around here in England is the great cormorant, which can be often be found in relatively any relatively large body of water. Um, and yeah, they can actually be quite visually striking. A lot of them have quite bright patches on their face and things like that. And if you get a close look, some of them have like really pretty eyes too. Like
Yeah.
double-crested cormorants have like these like green and blue eyes. Like wow, it's really neat. There are several species that will grow like these display plumes as well when it's breeding season. So yeah, they do have they can be quite a visually appealing. So yeah, cormorants are definitely a familiar group and a rather successful group. We will look at some extinct cormorants on the next slide. So there are quite a few fossil cormorants that are known from the fossil record that have been named. I show here one of the earliest forms, Oligocorax from the Oligocene of Germany, which is known from essentially complete skeleton. So it was a pretty small cormorant. It within the size range of the smaller living species. It wasn't smaller than the smallest living species, but around the same size as them. Um, and it seems to have been a stem cormorant. It lacks a few of the features that are shared within the crowned cormorants, but yeah, this is one of the earlier known species of cormorant. For a more recently extinct species, that would be the one pictured on the right here. That is the spectacled cormorant, which in historic times was found on Bering Island near Russia. Um, but we also know from the fossil record it used to live during the Pleistocene in Japan as well. So this was the largest known cormorant that we know of. And probably it got so big because it lived so far north that it needed to be big to be able to keep warm enough. Um, and it is said from historical accounts that it seems to have been reluctant to fly, although it is not clear that it was actually flightless or not. Probably it wasn't, but maybe it didn't like to fly very much because it was so heavy and big. Um, so it was like I don't know, the size of a turkey, something like that. So
Oh
fair,
wow.
yeah, yeah, rather impressive animal. Unfortunately, soon after people encountered it, they quickly hunted it to extinction and for food and things like that. So yeah, no longer with us today. But even so, there are plenty of other cormorant species that are doing very well, as we have seen. So their legacy continues on, you could say. Do you have anything else to add about these guys?
Not really. No.
Alrighty. Um, let's continue. So there actually is one more Suliform group that we haven't covered, and that's because it is an extinct group, an entirely extinct group, and that is the Plotopterids. Now, these guys are known currently from the Eocene to the first half of the Miocene, And so far, they've only been found in the North Pacific, Western North America and Japan. And what's very odd about this group is that they were flightless, wing-propelled divers. Whoa, where have we seen that before?
No, I wonder.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, we've seen that before in auks, in the great auk, and also in the extinct Mancowling auks. Okay, but both are extinct, but the great auk is more recently extinct. Um, and of course, also in the penguins. So this is a third example of wing-propelled, flightless diving bird group. Um, well, actually, it's really the fourth example because the great auk and the Mancowling auks probably evolved their flightlessness independently. So yeah, Pletopterids, as might not be a surprise, a lot of their bones are actually very similar to penguins, especially in the forelimb, and oddly enough, very similar to some of the stem penguins, some of the earliest penguins. And so, even until very, very recently, there have been paleontologists who have suggested, maybe they have a lot of similarities to penguins. Maybe they are related to penguins. That they are stem penguins that made it into the North Pacific, which is quite a interesting thought. However, it seems more recently, as we have gotten better fossils of Plutopterids and also of stem penguins, kind of more detailed comparisons between them and also with Suliforms, seems to suggest that it is more likely that Pletopterids are a very weird group of Suliforms instead. So they have various features in the shoulder girdle and the feet and in the skull that are similar to modern Suliforms, and those similarities are less easily explained by convergence towards a wing-propelled diving lifestyle. So it does seem that the best supported position for them at the moment is within the Suliforms. But even so, they were very penguin-like, and the largest, in fact, were comparable in size to giant stem penguins that we talked about last time. So, they got like human-sized, basically. Yeah, these were big birds. And interestingly enough, they also seem to have disappeared around the same time. So, giant penguins, the youngest known fossils are known from the Miocene, and those are just fragments. And it seems that the youngest known Pletopterids that we know of are also Miocene and from the early Miocene at that. So yeah, perhaps they faced very similar kind of pressures that drove them to extinction. We did talk about how the seals and the toothed whales were starting to diversify around that time, and certainly that could have also impacted the Pletopterids as well. Um, Anything you have to add about these guys?
Oh, I thought these were interesting birds and kind of mysterious too for
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
I don't see them a lot in paleo media. They
No,
should probably get some more press.
right, definitely. They are a very interesting group, and I agree. Like we don't hear about them enough, and yeah, we don't even relatively speaking, we don't even get that many studies about them compared to say penguins. Like penguins have lots and lots and lots of papers written about them in terms of the fossil taxa, but yeah, not as much for Pletopterids. And in fact, I had a real trouble finding an image for the slide. So there are a number of skeletal mounts of these guys from various museums in Japan, but there are very few photos of these in on the internet, and most of the ones I could find were not available for me to use. So yeah, it's actually quite tricky to find because I did want to show a picture of kind of a whole skeleton so you can kind of get an idea of what they probably look like and the proportions and all that. But most of the figures and papers were like individual bones and things. Um,
Uh,
yeah, eventually I was able to find in Gerald Meyer's book, he did have a figure of a skeletal mount, which is from a Japanese museum as it happens. And so since I cite his book as one of my resources, I decided to use it under fair use, hopefully. Um, but yeah, it's very tricky to find those images. Definitely, these guys need more press.
I wonder if they're more well known in Japan than say the United States.
I Yeah, I don't know about like the general public, but I would imagine that on average perhaps because many of the best fossils of Pletopterids, including the largest specimens, are known from Japan. So I would guess that maybe they are better known, and Japan does have overall pretty strong interest in natural history from what I've seen. Like when I went to the museum gift shops there, there were like plush Anomalocaris for sale and things like that. Um, there
Yeah,
were
Japan is like perfect with that kind of stuff. I
right.
mean, I think of like popular culture. There was that dinosaur anime
Oh,
that
true.
kind of was around Twitter earlier. Not the one with the baby and Kylosaur. Like
Right,
that's a
right.
great one. That's not. But it was like the one where, oh my god, it's like these two kids and like this sock puppet frog robot thing, and they go to like the different time periods of the Mesozoic, and it's like this is like 90s or like
Yeah.
early 2000s, so
Huh.
like Greg Pauline style dinosaurs and all these obscure genera.
Yeah.
Margosaurus was in there, Carnotaurus. Wow, like you know, I kind of wish we had something like this,
Right.
for like cartoons,
Right, right.
in the US. Amazing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Not to mention they have like documentaries made based on Dougal Dixon's books like Afterman
Yeah.
and like manga based on his books and yeah, yeah, they're into that. So
Awesome.
yeah, definitely. So I would imagine like maybe Pletopterids are better known, especially in the cities near where their fossils have been found. Um, But yeah, let's go on to the next slide where I talk a bit about Suliform phylogeny. So the phylogeny of Suliforms is pretty well figured out at this point, both from genetics and morphology. So to no one's surprise, the Anhingas and cormorants are closely related, and of course they share that very distinctive wing-drawing behavior. And the boobies are sister to them, and the frigatebirds are kind of the odd group out in this instance. As for the Pletopterids, it seems that currently the best supported position for them is close to the clade containing boobies, anhingas, and cormorants, um, but outside of them. And there are a few kind of skeletal details that seem to suggest that. So that's where we have them for now. Now, let's go on to the last kind of major group of Pelecanimorphs, and these are the Pelecaniforms. So these are the pelicans and herons and their relatives. Now, there are over 100 living species of Pelecaniforms, and so they are certainly a big chunk of Pelecanimorph diversity. Now, because of the kind of reshuffling that I mentioned earlier, kind of reclassification of all these groups, we haven't identified many uniting anatomical features that seem to be shared within all members of this of the Pelecaniformes proper. So the modern sense of the group, where we understand are actually close relatives. But there are some features in like the maxilla, which is one of those upper jaw bones, and the palate, that might be ancestral features of this group. So perhaps we need more study to be sure. And most members of the Pelecaniforms, except for the ibises, have a very distinctive flight posture. When they're flying, they will kind of fold the neck back, retracting it, even though they tend to have very long necks. Like so, even in things like herons, which as shown here, a white-faced heron in flight, and you can see it has a really long neck, but it's actually retracted all the way so that it's flush with its body, so it looks like it doesn't have such a long neck at all. And so this is actually one of the best ways in the field where you can distinguish herons from other kind of similar looking long-legged birds is if you see one flying, see this really long-legged bird flying and it's got this retracted neck, it's probably a heron and not a crane or a stork because those guys like to fly with their necks kind of extended straight out. Do you have anything to add before we move forward?
Not really, but I mean, yeah, I mean, that's a very distinctive posture for sure. It's like,
Mm,
yeah, I see a heron and a pelican in flight, and it's almost always with the neck all curved like that.
right. Yeah. 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 There are a lot of I know internet memes maybe like joking about heron necks because they're able to fold the necks up so much that they look like they barely have one and then they shoot they can shoot it straight out. Um, yeah. So people like to riff on that, but it is quite a distinctive trait that they have. All right, but first of all, let's talk about the group that does not fly with a retracted neck, and that is the ibises. And you'll notice on the slide here that I also have pictured a spoonbill, and that is because the spoonbills, we now understand, are actually nested inside the ibis clade. So they are actually, very weird and specialized ibises with oddly shaped bills. Um, Now, ibises, as we shall see, are known from the Eocene onward, at least the total group, so including stem ibises. And there are over 30 living species, so that's fairly diverse, and they can be found on every continent except for Antarctica. Although they also prefer kind of relatively warm regions of the world. Um, I have seen a few species in North America. I've seen glossy ibis once in Maryland, and I've also seen American white ibis when I visited Louisiana. Um, have you ever seen them?
I know I've seen once
Yeah.
an American white ibis.
Ah.
I think, and I can't remember for sure. Like this was in the Outer Banks,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and I think that's about the northernmost part of their
I
range.
think so.
Um,
Yeah.
so it's kind of like an outlier.
Right.
I might be wrong. I have to check, but
Mhm.
no, of course zoos. I
Oh yeah.
see these all the time. I mean, uh, growing up, I was very familiar with the scarlet ibis
Yes.
and the roseate spoonbill.
Mhm.
Two birds I'm very fond of. They're beautiful birds.
Yeah. Totally.
Um, there was one aviary where I just got to like sit with a roseate spoonbill like a foot or two away from me. It was like sitting on a rock, and I just kind of sat there and I'm just
Yeah.
hanging out with this bird. And yeah, that was a really fun memory for me.
That's amazing.
So yeah, very familiar with these birds for
Right.
sure.
Yeah, and they are definitely very distinctive looking. Of course, most ibises have that very slender, down curved bill, whereas in spoonbills it's kind of widened out into a sort of spatulate shape. Um, Quite a notable feature that they have is that their bills are very sensitive at the tip, and we talked about this a little bit before. Also seen in some of the shorebirds, so they have a very sensitive bill tip that they can use to they can stick into the sand or the water and detect prey that way, without actually touching the prey item itself. And this is also kind of how ibises feed. They have these very sensitive bill tips, so they can probe into the mud or the water. And in the case of spoonbills, what they'll do is they'll dip their bill in the water and sweep it from side to side. And then if they kind of bump into something nearby, they can quickly snap it up. So they're not really feeding like ducks. So as you might recall, ducks are in large part filter feeders. So they have these little filter feeding plates inside their mouth that they're using to filter out tiny particles. Whereas spoonbills are more grabbing kind of slightly larger prey, like things like fish and shrimp and things like that. Um, but yeah, they also have these very sensitive bills to help them detect their prey. And in fact, this was kind of one of the things that kind of fueled the whole ancestral shorebird hypothesis, if you recall that from the shorebird episode. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, because people were seeing like these kind of similarities and saying, "Oh, okay, so this fossil, which turned out to be a stem ibis, is clearly like a transitional form between the shorebirds and the ibises and things like that. And so this is evidence that the shorebirds gave rise to all the other birds. Um, so yeah, it's understandable why that kind of assumption could be made. Interesting enough, several recently extinct ibis species were flightless, all of them island dwelling as far as we know. So one of these were the two species of apter ibis, which literally means like no winged ibis, although it does have very tiny little wings, from the Hawaiian Islands. And a third extinct flightless ibis we will meet on the next slide. Although before I talk about the weird flightless ibis on the right, I just wanted to show the stem ibis on the left. That is Rhynchaedes, which is known from many fossils from the Eocene of Europe, especially from the Messel Formation in Germany. And it is quite interesting because, for one, now this is basically a scan from a paper copy of a paper. So that's why the image quality is not super great. But if you look towards the bottom of the image, you can see the hind limbs of Rhynchaedes, and they are much shorter relative to the body compared to a modern ibis. So I guess I mentioned that earlier, didn't I? So yeah, it seems that at least this particular stem ibis was not as specialized for wading as our modern ibises are. Something else it doesn't have, which is found in modern ibises, is that it doesn't have those little sensitive pits, or rather, it doesn't have those little pits in the bill tip that are correlated with really sensitive bill tips, which modern ibises, of course, have. We've talked about before in some of the other birds too. Um, so it seems that Rhynchaedes was not as specialized for kind of wading out of the water and probing for food like a modern ibis is. So probably maybe feeding on the shoreline, but not so much wading as such. So yeah, that's a little bit of interesting thing there, and that's one of the reasons why I speculated that maybe the ancestral Pelecanimorph was some kind of like shoreline bird, but that was not spectacularly long-legged, but perhaps was feeding in association with water. But that is of course just one fossil taxon, so of course more fossils would be good. As for the very weird flightless ibis, so that's the one on the right, and that's Xenis ibis from the Holocene of Jamaica. So it probably died out, relatively recently, although we don't know exactly when it went extinct. And what's really weird about Xenis ibis is that even though it was flightless, and you can see from the skeletal kind of reconstruction there that it has a relatively small breastbone, for example, so it probably it wasn't able to fly, but it did have these really relatively long wings. And on the bottom there, you can see the forelimb bones on, so H on top is the forelimb bones of Xenis ibis, and on the bottom is a modern flying ibis. And you can see that they're, roughly the same length. Um, and something else really weird about the Xenis ibis is that its hands, so the hand bones near the tip of the wing, so towards the left on this image, are modified into this really weird kind of shape. And so, what was this for? Well, people have speculated about this for a while, and in fact, I think people have even speculated that, oh, maybe this is a quadrupedal bird, that it was using its wings for walking, which would be pretty weird. It definitely would be very unusual for any kind of theropod dinosaur. We don't currently have any conclusive evidence of quadrupedal theropods, or these regularly quadrupedal theropods. Um, but more recently, it has been thought, and I think this is probably more likely, that these wings, in fact, were weaponized wings. So Xenis ibis was using that very thickened kind of hand region of its wings as clubs, basically. And people have found like fractures and things in some of the specimens, I believe. So we do have some evidence for this kind of function for the wings. And what was it using these wings to fight? Well, probably each other for one. Of course, a lot of birds with weaponized wings tend to use them against each other, and when they get into some kind of dispute. But it, of course, could have also been used against predators. Now, they lived on an island where there weren't a lot of mammalian predators, but there were still birds of prey, and there were still some large snakes, and baby ibises are not precocial. They are altricial, which means that they are nest bound for a period of time and kind of helpless. Um, so perhaps it would have been important for the adults to be able to defend their babies against some of these predators. So perhaps it was using these wings as a defense as well. Yeah, definitely a very, very interesting bird. We don't really see, even though we do see kind of weaponized forelimb structures in other birds, we don't see them, quite like this, in terms of modifying the hand skeleton in this particular manner. Do you have anything to add about ibises?
Not particularly. You mentioned we don't know when Xenocybus
Hmm.
went extinct.
Yeah, we don't like the fossils are not very well dated.
Oh, that's interesting. I know. Well, I know I've read that human settlement on Jamaica
Hmm.
commenced around 1400 years ago.
Hmm.
So I'm
Okay.
curious, like, if the dates converge.
Yeah.
Because of course that goes to the whole island extinction
Right.
phenomenon.
Right.
And I know the Caribbean in particular is a region that was hit very hard by
Hmm.
human settlements of various types.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good question. I hope we can get some better constraints on the dates there. But yeah, I mean, my certainly my default assumption would be that yeah, they encountered humans and were wiped out as a consequence. Um, but yeah, we're not really sure at the moment.
Interesting.
But yeah, let's take a look at the next group. And so this is also a very distinctive and unusual group. Yeah,
Yeah.
The shoebills. So there is only one living species, so we call it the shoebill. Although it has a few other names too. Sometimes you might see the whalebill. Either way, you can probably see how it got its name, because it's got that very distinctive looking beak. It's huge, and nothing else has a beak quite like that. Um, we do have some shoebill fossils from the Oligocene onwards, but they're mostly very fragmentary, so they don't really tell us too much. They do tell us that some of the shoebills around back then were already very big birds, and certainly a modern shoebill is a very large bird. Like they can get like over a meter tall, like almost 5 feet. Um, so they are definitely quite large, and they can be quite intimidating looking. You've probably seen photos of them where they're able to, they're able to kind of stare straight ahead at themselves, and they have these kind of angry looking kind of brow ridges. And so, looking straight at you, they look very angry. And definitely, I often see people posting pictures of them, like when they want to show, oh, how dinosaurian modern birds look. People often use a shoebill, like look at this prehistoric looking, angry looking, intimidating, scary creature. Um, which is quite interesting, and you can see why shoebills have that reputation. But in fact, in reality, they are actually quite secretive and shy birds. They are not really known to be aggressive towards humans, um, and they like to live in very dense, well vegetated marshes in tropical Africa. Um, and yeah, they're actually pretty hard to approach. So if they see you, they're likely to fly away or walk away into the vegetation. So yeah, they are not quite as scary as perhaps their reputation suggests. If you're not one of their prey items, anyways. So what are their prey items? Well, they'll eat a lot of things that live in the water. They'll eat amphibians and various kinds of fish, and there's even an anecdotal account um, of them preying on juvenile antelope. Um, but primarily their prey are the lungfish and bikers, which is kind of interesting because we mentioned lungfish and bikers in a recent episode, in our news episode, when we were talking about Tiktaalik, stem tetrapod. Um, and so both lungfish and bikers are fishes that have retained the ancestral air-breathing ability of bony fishes, and I mentioned this in the episode where we talked about Tiktaalik too. So ancestrally, all bony fish are able to breathe air in addition to breathing with their gills. So the ancestor of all bony fish was an aquatic animal that probably never came onto land, never even considered coming onto land, but was able to breathe air using its lungs to supplement the oxygen it got from its gills, which is of course quite useful because the oxygen concentration in the air tends to be much higher, and sometimes if you're living in still freshwater habitats, those tend to be very stagnant and with very low oxygen concentration, especially in the water. Um, and both lungfish and bikers are fishes that have retained this ancestral ability to extract oxygen with both the lungs and the gills. Um, and lungfishes are like us land vertebrates, lobe-finned fishes, whereas the bikers are ray-finned fishes, so they're more closely related to things like goldfish and seahorses and groupers and salmon and such. But both of them do have these very well-developed functional lungs, and in fact, both of them rely on their lungs to get enough oxygen to breathe. So even though they do have gills and they do use their gills to extract some oxygen, they have to have access to the air in order to get all of the oxygen they need. If you don't let a biker or a lungfish come up to breathe air, they will drown. Um, so yeah, that is quite interesting. But it does allow them to live in these marshes in tropical Africa where the water levels are very low and there's often not that much flowing water. But it also means that they are exposed to predation from the shoebill, because if they come up to the surface to breathe and a shoebill notices them, it'll lunge downwards and quickly grab them with that massive bill. And I mentioned, I think, in the Tiktaalik episode, how bikers have a more kind of sneaky way of breathing air instead of just gulping, taking a big gulp with the mouth. And well, this is one of the reasons why they like to be sneaky when they're breathing, because they don't want to attract the attention of this gigantic theropod that might come and eat them in one gulp. Um, Yeah, and so the shoebills, when they catch prey, they use this kind of downward lunging motion. In fact, they will. It is often so dramatic that they basically will do a gigantic face plant into the water when they're grabbing their prey, and then they have to use their wings to kind of push themselves back up into an upright position. Uh, so that's a sort of kind of semi quadrupedal motion for a theropod, probably about one of the closest a theropod has gotten to being a quadruped. Um, but yeah, certainly a very distinctive looking bird. I have been fortunate enough to see them in captivity. Of course, I've never been to Africa, so I haven't seen them wild. But in captivity, definitely, and they are quite striking birds. How about you?
I can't honestly remember if I've seen a shoebill at
Hmm.
the zoo or not. I'm going through all the different zoos I've been to, and
Yeah.
I feel like that's a bird I would have remembered
Right.
seeing.
Right.
That's more distinctive. The only thing that can come to mind, I guess that's sort of related to this, is there's the L.C. Bates Museum in Maine.
Hmm.
I may have mentioned it before on the show. It's an old school, like, cabinet of curiosities sort of place with all
Hmm.
kinds of natural history and local history phenomena. And in their their huge bird hall, tucked away in a little tiny shelf on a corner, is a shoebill skull.
Oh wow.
I always would look for that whenever I'd come and visit every year or so.
Right.
So that's probably the most experience I've had with the
Hmm.
shoebill.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, they're not easy birds to come by, and that's definitely a very distinctive skull for sure. Really striking. Um, I guess one other thing I'll mention about the shoebill is that its phylogenetic affinities have been in heavy debate for a long time. Um, so of course one of its common names is the shoebill stork, but of course if you've gotten this far into the episode, you can infer that the shoebill is not a stork because we didn't talk about it when we were talking about the storks. Um, some people have considered it possibly very closely related to herons, and of course it does have some similarities to herons. But others have considered it maybe more closely related to pelicans. Now, of course, we now know all of those are pelecaniforms, so it's not that surprising that there would be this kind of a confusion about the affinities. Um, now, with the genetic information that we have now, it has largely confirmed that one of the closest living relatives of the shoebills are the pelicans. They are all pelecaniforms, but the shoebills are more closely related to pelicans than to the herons. Um, Now, there is another bird that also seems to belong to this kind of close to pelicans part of the tree, and that is the hammercop. On the next slide, the hammercop is also known from only one living species, which is also known mostly from Africa, although it gets a little bit into the Middle East as well. Um, and looking at the hammercop, you can kind of tell it kind of does look like a little brother of the shoebill, doesn't it? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, um, you can see the family resemblance there. Now, the hammercop is much smaller than the shoebill. It's about the size of a crow, um, but it definitely, in terms of overall body plan, you can see the similarities. Um, and I think the name Hammerkop comes from Afrikaans for basically meaning a hammer head. And you could
Mhm.
probably see the resemblance there too, right?
Oh yeah, it's like a hammer turned to the left.
Right, right. Yeah, exactly. Now, the hammerkop often lives in more open wetlands than the shoebill does, so they're quite a bit easier to see. Um, and basically, and it's a lot more widespread across the continent as well. And basically, as long as there are some trees, it's happy because they nest in trees. But as long as there's some trees and water, that's pretty good habitat for them. Um, and kind of similarly to shoebill, and also similar to herons for that matter, is it mostly hunts prey by kind of stalking through the water and looking for fish and frogs. It especially likes to eat clawed frogs, the genus Xenopus, um, which is commonly used as a lab animal and sometimes kept as a pet. And it will quickly lunge down and grab it with that very large bill that it has, although of course not quite as big as the shoebill's bill. Um, We do have like one fossil species of hammercop known from South Africa. It seems to have been, I think, a slightly larger species that has been suggested to have been more specialized for swimming, which would be very odd. But yeah, it's only known from like some foot bones, I think. But yeah, that's the only fossil hammercop that we have. So that's a Pliocene bird. So we don't have much of a fossil record for this lineage. Something unusual about the living hammercop, we don't know if it was the case for the fossil one, is that they build some of the biggest nests of any bird. Even though they're the size of a crow, they can build a nest that's like over a meter wide up in the trees, and like a person can stand on top of the nest without collapsing it. Um,
Wow.
yeah. So they built this big nest out of sticks and all cemented together with mud. And the nest is not like an open bowl-shaped nest like you might think of when you think of a bird nest, but like it's a nest with a roof on top. So it's a covered nest, and the entrance to the nest is on the underside. So on the inside, there's a nesting chamber, basically.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, that's really amazing. Um, we're not sure why they built such a big nest. Yeah, it's not clear. Some people have suggested that maybe it's just a side effect of them laying a lot of eggs because they can lay up to like I think 7 or 8 eggs in a clutch, which is quite a few for a bird of this size. So maybe having such a big nest is just to contain that many eggs. But I have to wonder if there's something we're missing here. Uh, yeah, it's definitely something that deserves more study. I guess in terms of personal experiences, of course, I haven't seen a wild hammercops because I've never been to Africa, but I have seen them in zoos, and I did get to see the ones at the National Zoo in Washington D.C. building a nest once in their kind of walk-through aviary enclosure. So that was really cool. Yeah, they really did have a gigantic nest up in the trees, and I saw one of them like collecting a nesting material. Um, but instead of gathering a stick to add to the nest, it had for some reason a feather. So it was adding some other materials to the nest in addition to sticks.
The National Zoo.
Yeah.
I've been there. I've probably seen them then.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that sounds about right. It's cool to see them making a nest.
Right.
That's I almost never get the chance to see that.
Yeah.
Um, I guess the closest thing I can think of was seeing an ostrich egg on the ground at the
Ah,
museum zoo.
that's cool.
But I mean, it's just one of those things, like,
Yeah.
oh, they it's all done.
Right. Yeah. But something else kind of notable about the hammercop nest building is that they're kind of compulsive nest builders. So like a pair of them will build like oftentimes a ton of different nests in like their kind of home range. Oh, and only use one of them. So yeah, that's quite interesting. Maybe the other nests are like decoys, perhaps, but I don't know. That seems possible, but it definitely seems a lot of effort to go to, considering how big those nests are. Um, in any case, definitely a very unusual bird. But we don't really have much of a fossil record for them, so we're gonna go to the next group if you don't have anything else to add.
Nope.
Alrighty. Now, the pelicans, of course, are the group that the Pelecaniformes and the Pelecanimorphs are named after, and they are very distinctive birds, and I'm sure that most people know what a pelican looks like. Um, there are 8 living species of pelican, and they are known from the Oligocene onward, but most of their fossils are pretty fragmentary, although I will show one on the next slide. They can be found on all the continents except for Antarctica, but mostly in the warmer regions of the world, similar to the Suliforms, or most of the Suliforms. And oddly enough, they're not really found in the interior of South America. It's not clear to me why, but yeah, in South America they're mostly only found on the coastlines. Um, and speaking of which, they can be found in both the coastal marine habitats and also in freshwater habitats. So they're widespread in that regard. And speaking also of Suliforms, I mentioned before how it used to be thought that the members of Suliformes and the pelicans together were a clade of the traditional Pelecaniforms, which we now know is not the case. And but it is understandable why people thought this was the case, because pelicans have a lot of anatomical similarities with Suliforms that are probably convergent. So they both have this naked throat pouch, which of course is very well developed in the pelicans. They both have toady palmate feet with webbing between all of their toes. They both incubate their eggs using their feet instead of using a brood patch, and they both don't have external nostrils. So what gives? Yeah, good question. It's really a striking example of convergence. Onto the kind of their most famous feature, perhaps, is the throat pouch. Now, what is that used for? I guess in popular culture, it is often depicted as a way for pelicans to store food for them to eat later, but that's not really the case. They don't really use it for that in reality. Um, it is used primarily to capture prey. And the way that most pelicans feed is that they'll swim on the water surface, and then they'll kind of suddenly dunk their heads down into the water, and then scoop up whatever they want to catch. And the way they do this, what they'll often do is they'll dunk their head in the water with the mouth open wide, and then with their upper jaw, they can kind of chase the prey towards the pouch. Right, the prey is trying to get away from the upper jaw, but then it swims right into the pouch. The pelican scoops it up along with all that water, and then it's caught the prey inside that pouch. And then it takes a little while for the pelican to squeeze the water from its pouch. So it would do this by kind of pressing the pouch against its body, so that the water can be pushed out of the pouch, leaving just the prey inside. And then once that's done, it'll swallow the prey. Um, Now, this water draining process takes a little bit of time, takes a while. So what will often happen is some smaller seabirds will take advantage of this, and they will wait for when the pelican has caught something, and then they'll hang around nearby and try to grab the prey from the pelican's mouth while it's draining water from the pouch. Yeah, yeah, you can see quite a few photos of this. Like a lot of little terns and gulls will even perch on the pelican's head while it's doing this. Yeah. Yeah. But lest you think that pelicans are, all that innocent, they are certainly quite capable of taking advantage of other birds' catches themselves. They'll definitely, if they see other birds with fish, they'll often harass them and try to steal their catches. So yeah, it's a kind of a bird world out there. I saw a clip on Twitter once. It was an osprey, which is a fishing raptor, that I had caught a fish and had just taken off from the water surface with the fish in its talons, and then suddenly this pelican lunges at it and just grabs the fish from its feet, and yeah, so
Jeez.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
pelicans are. Oh my god! I know, like, they're birds and they do what they gotta do, but I don't know. For me, like, pelicans are kind of assholes. Like
Yeah,
they like, yeah, bird. It's a bird eat bird world. They like the way that they eat
yeah,
birds sometimes is just
yeah,
friggin' nuts. I cannot wrap my head around how these things just will, like, walk up to birds just minding their own business and then just pick them up and just, like, engulf them with the pouch.
right,
Like, it works.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
what, birds don't think to, like, it's skin, right?
yeah, yeah.
They can't just, like, poke out, whatever. It just, oh, it's weird. It's just weird.
Yeah, it's pretty freaky. And I was actually about to mention that. Yeah, so of course, primarily pelicans prey on fish, and so that's a whole. That's why I mentioned where the whole kind of scooping stuff out of the water and draining water comes in. But yes, they will also prey on other birds, and very infamously, there are several videos out there on YouTube of pelicans eating pigeons in city parks, and yeah, and it really it really isn't a pretty kind of sight, because it's not a quick death for the prey item either. It's a very drawn out process as a pelican tries to swallow the prey, and it takes like several minutes to go down. It's yeah, not
Yeah.
fun. Um, there's also a sequence from one of the BBC documentaries. I seem to be mentioning them a lot in this episode. I think it's from the series Life, the one that's just called Life, not Life of anything. Um, uh,
Oh,
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. It's showing pelicans hunting baby gannets. Yeah, so it's kind of wild because it's basically I think they're off the coast of Africa, and so the gannets are nesting on one predator-free island, and the pelicans are also nesting probably on another predator-free island nearby, and apparently fish are not as abundant as they used to be, so the pelicans will travel to the gannet nesting site, and any gannet chick that is not being guarded by a parent at that moment is gonna get snapped up and engulfed into the pouch, and that's the end of that. Um, yeah, they can be quite disturbing in terms of some of their habits. Um, I guess to continue on with some of their feeding strategies. Sometimes they will feed in a synchronized manner, so a whole group of them will kind of swim together in a line, and then they will suddenly, when they find maybe a group of fish in the water, they will encircle the fish, and then suddenly all together dunk their heads into the water and scoop up the fish. So that's kind of fun. Um, there are two species of pelicans: the brown pelican from North America and the Peruvian pelican from South America, which will actually plunge dive from the sky and dive into the water to catch their prey. And they can't dive as deep as the boobies do, so they're mostly plunge diving close to the surface. But it's still pretty spectacular, especially for such large birds to see them do this. And something else about pelicans is that they're super pneumatic, so they have a lot of hollow air spaces in their bones, and that's another reason why they can't dive very deep. But nonetheless, it seems to be an effective feeding strategy for them. Um, and I guess one other thing I'm going to mention is yeah the lower jaws of pelicans are very stretchy, so they're or more accurately they're very bendy in a lateral direction, and so they can expand out to the sides. They're very wide, so that helps them kind of scoop up a bunch of water at once, a great volume of water together with prey items, hopefully. um, and that is interesting because you know what, they are convergent in this regard with some of the baleen whales. um, because baleen whales also have these very long and narrow kind of lower jaws in terms of like each half of the lower jaw are composed of these very long and narrow bones. And in baleen whales, the lower jaw can also kind of spread apart to increase the surface for engulfment. And baleen whales also have an expandable throat area to engulf a ton of water at once. And furthermore, they are, even though their lower jaws are very bendy side to side, they are not so bendy up and down because that's they need to be able to resist kind of the force of the water, as the in the case of baleen whales when they lunge forward towards a school of plankton or small fish, and in the case of pelicans when they're doing a similar thing from the water surface, when they're trying to scoop up a beak full of prey. And so there's an interesting kind of convergence between the skull shape in pelicans and in baleen whales in terms of the skull shape and how their jaws actually function. And my supervisor Daniel Field, he actually wrote a paper about this, which I cite in the references list. Um, so yeah, that's pretty neat. Um, I guess in terms of traveling, pelicans like storks have very long and broad wings for thermal soaring, so that allows them to travel from place to place. If the fishing's not so good in one lake, they can fly off to a different one without expending much energy. So they are also very good thermal soars, very similarly shaped, kind of long, broad wings. And I guess the last bullet point I have on here is that pelicans include some of the largest living flying birds. So, like the largest pelican species can get up to like over 10 kilograms. So that puts them up there in terms of extant flying bird size. So yeah, they are quite big and impressive when you see them in person. Um, let's see. In terms of personal experiences with them. I've of course seen them pretty often in captivity. I did see Australian pelicans when I was in Australia, and I do remember when I was very young, I visited Florida. My family visited Florida, so that was the first and only time I've been to Florida. I do wish I could go back at some point. Um, but I do remember one of the wildlife species we saw were brown pelicans. So there's that. How about you? Hmm.
Yeah, the brown pelican. That's another common
Hmm.
shorebird for me.
Yeah.
Whenever I visit the Outer Banks, if I'm lucky, I'll see a row of them just kind of riding the waves
Yeah, neat.
in like a little parade. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, I remember growing up, like one of my first experiences in, I guess this kind of goes back to like us complaining about animated films and
Yeah.
stuff. Was watching Finding Nemo and the whole
Oh yeah.
sequence with the pelicans, and then like reading up and then finding out that the brown pelican doesn't live in Australia.
Oh right,
We used
right.
that species because it was familiar.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, well, one of the few like one of the few like major kind of biological errors, zoological errors that Finding Nemo made was yes, brown pelicans are not found in Australia. That is correct. Yeah, certainly the Australian pelicans I saw were very different looking. So, on the next slide, I do have a fossil pelican to show. Um, and that is well, it hasn't really been given its own name, but it has been assigned to the modern genus Pelecanus, which all extant pelicans are currently classified as. But something weird about it is that it's known all the way back from the Oligocene of France.
Ooh.
Um, and so it is known from this very well preserved skull. So you're looking at the skull from the top down here in top view, and then you can also see the neck vertebrae kind of curving around. So this is a really nice pelican fossil. And what's striking about it is that it looks a lot like a modern pelican. Yeah, it seems that even as far back as the Oligocene, there were already pelicans that looked like pelicans. And unfortunately, this is also one of the oldest pelican fossils known, so we don't really know anything about what pelicans were like before this. So yeah, that's definitely a big mystery in waterbird evolution. Do you have anything else to add?
Not really, no.
Alrighty. Finally, I think this is the last group within the Pelecaniforms we have to talk about, and that is the herons. Um, and herons are really, really diverse, over 60 living species. So yeah, more than all of the other Pelecaniforms put together. Uh, they are they are known probably from the Eocene onwards. There are some fragmentary fossils from the Eocene that seem to be herons, and the oldest known, like pretty convincing heron fossil might be from the Eocene. Like there's a bit of uncertainty about the dates there, so it might be Eocene or Oligocene. But either way, the herons were around by then, and we have evidence of them. And there are quite a number of fossil heron species that have been named, but most of them are like individual bones or parts of bones, and sometimes you can even identify them to like specific, modern heron lineages that they might be closely related to. But other than that, it's very difficult to say much about them. So, yeah, not unfortunately quite a fragmentary record in that regard. But even so, they're clearly very successful because they can be found worldwide, except for Antarctica, and sometimes there are vagrants, vagrants even there. Um, uh, a notable kind of geographic expansion that a particular species of heron has gone through in historical times is the cattle egret, which is native to Eurasia and Africa, but now it can be found on every continent except for Antarctica. And the cattle egret is, as its name suggests, it is found in close association with large herbivorous mammals, basically, and it will follow along where large mammals are, and then kind of pick up whatever insects get spooked up from the large mammal trampling through their homes. And of course, man has learned to do this with a domesticated cattle as well. And so, wherever people brought domesticated cattle and set up cattle ranches, the cattle egret has spread, and now it can be found pretty much all over the world. So that is pretty cool. Um, Now, herons do have quite a wide range of foraging techniques. So, in addition to picking up, to following kind of large mammals around, most heron species prefer aquatic prey. So, some of them will actually bait fish. So, they will actually pick up. Sometimes feathers, sometimes bits of food. I know, like I've seen footage of like herons picking up bread that people are throwing out to the ducks, and they'll take the piece of whatever they want to use as bait and put it in the water, and then fish will come along and try to investigate this floating little bit of stuff that might be food, and of course that's falling right into the heron's trap because the heron will then catch the fish. um, And there are other types of herons that will, like I mentioned for the anghingas earlier, kind of use their wings to create a bit of shade over the water, and that will sometimes attract fish too. And that's in fact what this tricolored heron on this slide is doing here. It's creating shade with its wings. Um, and there are all kinds of tricks that herons use to attract their prey. Um, yeah, like some herons have like these brightly colored feet, for example, and they'll kind of actually wiggle their feet around at the bottom of the water, and the fish will come and say, "Hey, what's this?" And then choop, they get eaten. Um, yeah, and then there are also some herons that will fly over the surface of the water and trail their feet behind them, and again there are these ripples over the water. Fish come along and say, "Hey, what's this?" Well, it's a heron, and it's gonna eat you. So yeah. All kinds of interesting feeding behaviors are found in this group. But no matter what kind of interesting techniques they use, the actual capture of prey tends to be pretty similar among herons. They have very specialized neck vertebrae, and so do the anghingas for that matter. Very specialized neck vertebrae that allow them to be kind of folded back, and then they sit and wait for a long time until they find something that comes along that takes their bait or simply is passing through, and then they can suddenly lunge out lightning quick and harpoon or stab or grab the prey item with that very long and sharp bill. Um, so yeah, they are very effective predators, and even though they feed mostly on aquatic prey, they're certainly not limited to it. They will of course catch fish and frogs and crustaceans and things, but they many species will also hunt on land as well. I know a lot of the larger heron species, like the great blue heron and the gray heron, they actually like to eat small mammals too, and they'll stalk around in fields looking for mice and gophers and things like that to feed on. They'll also hunt smaller birds. If smaller birds get too close when they're flying by, they will shoot out and grab them with that really long bill and long neck. So yeah, they are not very discriminatory predators, and the larger species can hunt like scarily big prey in some cases. Like they can hunt juvenile rabbits.
Oh,
Definitely, yeah, you can definitely find photos of that. They will hunt like stoats. Yeah, a mustelid is like a fierce little creature that fears nothing. But yeah, good luck fighting a giant harpoon-faced dinosaur. Um, they'll hunt quite large snakes and things. So all in all, it's very lucky for us that we are much too big for a heron to eat. Because yeah, we would not be safe. Um, and fortunately, herons are typically not very confrontational birds towards things that they don't eat. So if you get close to a heron, it'll walk away or fly away. It's not likely to behave aggressively towards you. However, I have heard from wildlife rehabbers that herons are some of the worst birds to work with. Like I've
no.
seen people, yeah, I've seen people say that they would rather work with raptors than with herons because a heron, if it it doesn't have the opportunity to escape from you, it will put that bill to good use and its very good aiming skills to good use because this is a thing that makes a living spearing small moving objects, and they know to aim for your eyes. So, uh, yeah, they are
Hmm.
dangerous to work with. Yeah. So if you find an injured heron or a heron that needs help and it's not in immediate danger, you should probably contact a professional. And that goes for any wildlife for that matter. But yeah, you definitely don't want to get too close to a heron without without proper training.
Yeah, my sister found that out the hard way.
Really?
Not physically
No,
though,
no,
but
yeah,
it was an interesting experience.
yeah.
We were at the Animal Kingdom at Disney World. Our first time going was a fantastic trip, and it's dinner time, and so we have an outside booth that we're going to get fried chicken and tasty things.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to go find a table, not knowing that because I got my food first. I went to go
Yeah.
find a table, not knowing that when my sister got her food, she would go and find a table too. So we're both trying to find a table to sit in.
Right.
And I'm just sitting at my table and I'm waiting and waiting and waiting, like, what the hell is taking so long? So
Right,
then
right.
I go back to the restaurant just to see what's up. And she comes back and she's cracking up with her plate. And she's like, "You're not going to believe what just happened."
Hmm.
So apparently, as she was going to find good seats, like a lot of the tables were crowded, she found this nice empty spot in the middle next to the water. And she's like, "Oh, this is perfect." And there's a bunch of birds hanging out there, including a big heron, like a great blue heron.
Wow.
And she's like, "Oh, this is perfect to see the cool animals up close, and
Right.
I'll sit there." But then there was this guy sitting across at a table way at the other end of the little area, speaking to her in Spanish, basically saying, "Hey, watch out for the birds." And Gabby didn't pick up on it very well, so this heron comes over, just kind of walks up to her, and like as Gabby kind of like gets up from the table,
Yeah.
like, okay, I don't like the way this bird's looking at me, picks up her tray and turns just to the left.
Yeah.
The bird lunges at the tray, grabs the whole chicken wing. Like, keep in mind, it's the arm
Wow.
and the shoulder part, and
Wow.
just yanks it up, and then brings it to all the other birds in a corner, and they start eating amongst themselves.
Wow. That's amazing.
She had to go back to like, yeah, we were cracking up, and she had to go, like, she wasn't upset, but
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
really funny. But she had to go back and say like, "Hey, listen, a bird ate my chicken." Another order, and they were like, "Oh, it happens all the time. Don't worry about it."
yeah. That's good. That's good. Oh, that's an amazing experience. Yeah, yeah. Herons do quickly learn when there's good food about, and I do see them like hanging around, at dining areas and in places like zoos, for example. And yeah, it's um, and yeah, they are of course quite widespread and adaptable birds. So I think anywhere where it's like moderately close to moderately large bodies of water, you're likely to find herons. I've certainly seen quite a few species, um, in all the places that I've been to pretty much, um, and I imagine it's much the same for you.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Herons, egrets,
Mm.
almost every day with them.
Yeah,
If I
yeah,
don't see them flying, I see them on the edge of the road and a ditch in the
right, right.
water, just hanging out. Um, and of course, I've seen a couple of them in zoos as well,
Yeah.
and on cattle fields especially.
Ah,
Like
yes.
the cattle egrets are very common.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I guess since it was mentioned, just to clarify, the egrets are is a name that's mostly used for some of the white species of herons that are mostly white plumaged in color. But not all of them are closely related to each other. Like the great egret, for example, is more closely related to the things like the great blue heron than to the little egrets, for example. So yeah, it's mostly a term that's just associated with a specific appearance that some herons have, um, or certain heron species that have a specific appearance. Um, but if you take a closer look, a lot of herons will often grow ornamental plumes and brightly colored skin patches on their face during the breeding season. That includes a lot of the egret species too. They can have quite striking appearances, definitely. Do you have anything else to add about herons?
Not really, no.
Alrighty, so I think on the next slide, I show the phylogeny of Pelecaniforms. And so I mentioned earlier that the shoebills are now understood to be closely related to the pelicans, and the hammerkops are also closely related to the pelicans, but currently the latest genetic studies still disagree on whether the hammerkop or the shoebill is more closely related to pelicans, so I have them here as a polytomy. The herons are the next group out, closely related to like kind of the pelican-related clade, and then the ibises are the odd ones out within the group. So that is a pelecaniform phylogeny. And finally, just to review, this is the big waterbird clade again. So we have finally covered all the members, right? These all the major lineages in this group. Hooray! So once again, the big waterbird clade that includes both the Phaethontomorphs and the Acornithians does not have a formal name yet, or at least we haven't agreed on one yet. So currently it has to go unnamed. But we do know that these two groups are probably closely related, forming this great radiation of mostly aquatically adapted predators. So Phaethontomorphs have the tropic birds and the weird Kagu and sunbittern. There are the loons that are very specialized foot-propelled divers. We have the penguins and Procelariforms that together form a clade, one lineage becoming flightless wing-propelled divers, and the other one becoming kind of great travelers over the ocean that are great at flying over the surface of the water. Um, And then we have the Pelecanimorphs, which include the Storks. We have the Suliforms, which include the frigatebirds and boobies and cormorants and anghingas, each of which have their own kind of feeding strategy. And we have the Pelecaniforms, which are the ibises and herons and pelicans, and plus the weird shoebill and hammerkop, and all of those have various different feeding strategies too. So yeah, I guess kind of moral of the story here is life is hard as a fish. I mean, there's this whole gauntlet of predatory dinosaurs that are out to get you, whether it's by stabbing or grabbing or diving or a bunch of other different ways to kind of make your day real bad. Um, so if you're a fish living in almost any kind of aquatic environment, unless you live like more than 500 meters below the surface of the ocean, there's probably some kind of theropod that likes to eat you and can get to you. Um,
Right. Or just grow really big like a whale
yeah,
shark.
right. Yes. Um, and this is just like this one clade of birds that are all closely related. So that's quite remarkable that we have spawned this great diversity of marine, well, aquatic predators just from the same stock. Um, and that's not to mention like all the other things that eat fish too. But this is not their series. If you are a land animal, if you are a small land animal, and even sometimes if you are a relatively big land animal, don't get too comfortable because, as we shall see on the next slide in the preview, there are a bunch of dinosaurs that are out to get you too. So, yeah. Okay. I know that one of the species here is primarily a fish eater, and one of them is a scavenger that does not hunt live prey. But that just goes to show kind of the big diversity of terrestrial kind of predatory dinosaurs of the world. And so next time on Dinosaurs, the second chapter, we are going to meet a couple of clades of our Cenozoic dinosaurs that have become adapted to feeding on vertebrate prey, mostly on land, although sometimes in the water still. And so, um, that will be next time. We will meet the hawks and vultures and owls and some of their relatives. Um, and that should be a fun one because these are, birds that have quite a big presence in popular culture. And as always, we would like to thank our friend Henry for the music and our friend Alicia for the color scheme of my Alvarezor avatar. Um, and you can follow us on Twitter if you enjoyed this episode, so you can stay up to date with our uploads. Of course, you can follow our YouTube channel directly if you also want to do that. Please leave comments if you have something to say or like the show or anything like that. We do enjoy receiving comments, or you can send us questions through email if that's more your thing. Um, and as usual, I will include links to my references I used for this episode, as well as some of the various links to websites I mentioned during the course of the episode, and you can check them all down in the description. So, with that, next week it will still be March, so I think we will come back to human origins with Joan.
That's right. We're going to talk about the human expansions or Homo sapiens expansions out of Africa and across the rest of the world. And that's going to be a fun episode. I can't wait to share with y'all.
That's a great story. I can't wait to hear it. So, with that, please stay safe, everybody, as always, and take care. See ya.
Yeah. See you later.